Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations hearing will now come to order. Today, the committee is holding a hearing entitled Protecting Unaccompanied Children, the Ongoing Impact of the Trump Administration's Cruel Policies. The purpose of today's hearing is to examine the Trump administration's care for unaccompanied children in government custody and the impact of administration policies on the health and well-being of children. The chair now recognizes herself for an opening statement. Today, this committee is continuing its oversight of the Trump administration's care for unaccompanied children. Last year, thousands of children were forcibly separated from their parents by the Trump administration. We heard the horror stories of how children were torn away from their families. No one will forget the images of crying children and helpless parents. Frankly, we all agree it's a shameful chapter in this country's history. In February, this subcommittee held a hearing about the callous family separation policy. Commander Jonathan White, who again joins us today, and I want to thank you, Commander White, testified that he tried to raise the alarm within the administration about the damage that would be done by separations. Unfortunately, those warnings went unheeded. We also heard from experts about how separating their children from their parents can cause a host of mental and physical health problems. We feared about the long-term traumatic consequences these children would endure for the rest of their lives. It appears now that we have proof that these fears have come true. A new report from the HHS Office of Inspector General is the first government accounting that details the emotional and psychological toll of separation of children from their parents. And we just got this report this week. Last year, investigators from the OIG went to 45 ORR facilities and spoke to approximately 100 mental health clinicians who provide care for unaccompanied children, including those who were separated. And what they heard is frankly heartbreaking. Mental health clinicians described how children cried inconsolably, and they believed their parents had abandoned them. One ORR program director told OIG, quote, "Every single separated kid has been terrified. We're seen as the enemy." OIG tells the story of one child who believed his father had been killed and that he would be killed also. Another medical director told OIG that the children described the emotional pain they were enduring, with one child saying, quote, "I can't feel my heart." We should not be surprised by these findings, but we should also not be complacent. We should take this report as a clarion call to ensure an injustice like this never happens again in this country. Moreover, there have been new developments since that crisis that again call into question this administration's ability to adequately care for unaccompanied children. This past summer, we were shocked again to see reports of children in unacceptable conditions at a CBP facility in Clint, Texas. Press accounts reported of toddlers at that facility without diapers, young children caring for infants they just met, and children unable to wash or to shower. I had to call Mr. Hayes during that ordeal to ensure that the agencies were working together to address these issues. To help alleviate that crisis, ORR eventually stood up an emergency influx facility in Carrizo Springs, Texas. But just as quickly as it got stood up, it got shut down. As the operator of the facility said, quote, "It was much too late." This episode raises important questions about how ORR and CBP are coordinating as they see trends shifting on the ground so that these kids are properly cared for. That's the most important thing. We're only beginning to appreciate the carnage that was unleashed by the administration last year. And it appears that unfortunately some have not learned their lesson, as we see policies coming from this administration that fail to treat these children with dignity and respect every day. So today is an opportunity to have an accounting of the fallout from these policies and to hear what's being done to ensure that no child is ever neglected again in the custody of this government. Finally, I just want to speak really briefly to the committee's ongoing investigation into the family separation crisis. I know, and the committee knows, There are hundreds of dedicated career staff at HHS who are devoting their lives and their careers to caring for these children. And the men and women of the Border Patrol put their lives on the line to protect our border. These staff did not create this crisis, and that's why the committee is demanding accountability from the leadership. But across the board, the administration is obstructing our legitimate congressional oversight to unprecedented levels, and it's no exception here. Our committee has had an 8-month-old request for documents from HHS about its role in the family separation crisis. HHS has produced thousands of non-responsive documents in order to look cooperative while it withholds documents from key leaders to whom Commander White raised concerns. It's still unclear who knew about the family separation policy before it was enacted and what, if anything, they did to try to stop it. From what I've seen, it seems at best HHS leaders should have known that it was coming and did not try to stop it. But since they're hiding documents, we also have to ask whether they were complicit. So I hope the administration, and HHS in particular, will show good faith cooperation with Congress and the stonewalling and air all of the facts to let the American people see for themselves. And Ranking Member Guthrie and I both agree that documents should be produced. I've talked to the administration several times and asked for narrow categories of documents to be produced, and they have not been produced. We once again repeat this demand. And with that, I yield back, and I recognize the ranking member for his opening statement for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair DeGette, for holding this hearing. The committee's oversight over the care and treatment of unaccompanied alien children by the Department of Health and Human Services, as well as the sponsorship process for unaccompanied children, extends back to 2014, with the first major influx of children and family units coming across our southern border. This influx overwhelmed the previous administration and resulted in children being placed with traffickers within the United States. Because of the work done by this committee and others, reforms were made to the Office of Refugee Resettlement Program, including improving the medical care available to children while in HHS care and custody. And I believe our member of the committee, Dr. Burgess, was instrumental in that. Well, I know he was, and I believe he was. Our work continued last Congress after the announcement and the end of the Zero Tolerance Initiative. As I said at our hearing earlier this year, I support strong enforcement of our nation's borders, but I do not support separating children from their parents. It was clear then, just as it is now, that these separations caused harm to the children involved. This spring, the U.S. Department of Homeland Security and HHS experienced another surge of children and family units coming across our southern border. The influx of migrants this year has been higher than in previous years, including large groups of people illegally entering the United States. For example, on May 29th, CPB agents apprehended over 1,000 migrants illegally crossing from our southern border as one group. Days earlier, CBP apprehended a group of over 400 individuals in the same area. By the end of July, DHS had referred over 63,500 unaccompanied children to HHS for this fiscal year alone. That number, which has certainly increased over the past 2 months, exceeded the total number of referrals in the fiscal year 2016 by more than 4,000. As highlighted in several Inspector General reports from both DHS and HHS, capacity and resources at CBP and ORR facilities were strained well beyond their limits. The increased number of immigrants, including unaccompanied children, resulted in overcrowding at CBP facilities as well as ORR facilities being at or near capacity. Among other problems, these capacity issues caused prolonged detention at CBP facilities that exceeded the 72-hour limit under the Flores settlement. Immigration trends are hard, if not impossible, to accurately predict. But influx numbers like the ones we saw in 2014 and again this year are examples of why it's critical to ensure that ORR has a capacity model that enables the agency and its grantees to acclimate and be in a position to accept and care for the unpredictable number of children that ebb and flow by the day, let alone month or year. Whether it's bed capacity, challenges with hiring and retaining personnel, or ensuring that grantee staff are appropriately screened and trained before being hired, or being allowed to interact with minors. All of these components are critical to ensuring that these children are cared for in the best available and safest way possible. It's not just HHS and ORR, though. This process from apprehension all the way to the placement of a child with a safe and appropriate sponsor crosses multiple departments and agencies within the federal government, which includes non-government entities such as ORR grantees. As a result, it is crucial to understand how CBP and HHS work together regarding their respective capacities, processing referrals, healthcare needs, background checks of potential sponsors, and more. Ensuring that this process in its entirety is working smoothly and efficiently will hopefully prevent some of the issues that arose earlier this year. Finally, this is the second hearing that this subcommittee has had on this topic this year, and I hope that we can start to discuss some solutions to the issues that we discussed at the hearing in February, and I'm sure we'll be discussing again today. In addition to sharing any challenges they faced over the last year, I invite the witnesses to share any ideas that they may have, particularly if there are ways which Congress can help. It is an important function of this committee not only to conduct oversight, but to use the information that is gained from its oversight to change the law when needed. I thank our witnesses for being here today and being part of this important discussion. I thank the chair for holding this, and I yield back.
Chair will now recognize the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Pallone, for 5 minutes for purposes of an opening statement.
Thank you, Matt. I guess I have to talk louder. Is that working? Thank you, Madam Chair. Today we're continuing our ongoing oversight of one of the most shameful actions of the Trump administration. Last year, this administration forcibly separated thousands of innocent children from their families, leading to widespread chaos and untold harm to these children. Experts sounded the alarm about what this would do to the children, and some of HHS's own career staff voiced concern at another oversight hearing on this issue earlier this year. But for reasons still unclear to this committee, those warnings were not heeded. Now the HHS Office of Inspector General has released a disturbing report on the effects the zero-tolerance policy has had on the children who were separated. The OIG is unambiguous, and I quote, "Separated children exhibited more fear, feelings of abandonment, and post-traumatic stress than did children who were not separated," unquote. Children were angry and confused because they believed their parents had left them. They isolated themselves, refused to eat. One separated child suffered such mental distress that he required emergency psychiatric care. These findings sound like they come from a dystopian novel, not a government report in 2019. But perhaps the most troubling aspect of these findings is that they were completely avoidable. No child should have to endure this anywhere, and the fact that it was a result of intentional government policy is outrageous. In addition to the family separation issue, there are lingering issues relating to planning and ongoing care for children in U.S. custody. For example, I want to understand how CBP are communicating and planning so that they can better manage the spikes in populations that seem predictable. This summer, for example, we saw the complete chaos as ORR and CBP had to deal with the influx of kids that resulted in hundreds being jammed into filthy facilities that were never designed for that purpose. And as soon as an influx shelter was set up by ORR to help relieve this pressure, it was shut down a few weeks later. I think there are clearly planning and communication lessons that need to be learned from this episode, and I want to know what those lessons are and if they're now being implemented. Regardless of which agency is holding a child at any given time, we need to make sure they're properly cared for throughout the system, and that includes ensuring that they receive appropriate vaccinations. It's critical that the administration has learned from its mistakes because, inexcusably, the administration continues to push policies that are only going to lead to more suffering. Recently, the Departments of Homeland Security and Health and Human Services issued a final regulation that essentially dismantles well-established protections for unaccompanied children known as the Flores Settlement. The regulation states that children will be treated, and I quote, with dignity, respect, and special concern for their particular vulnerability, unquote. But frankly, after the way we've seen this administration's approach to these populations, this promise lacks any credibility. We're not here today to attack the men and women who are doing their best to support the missions of these agencies, but the leaders of these departments have deliberately implemented policies that are not in the best interest of these vulnerable children, and that's not acceptable. There are many issues we intend to explore at this hearing, but we should not lose sight of the fact that everything comes down to one thing. What is the Trump administration doing to make sure these children are properly cared for? And that should be at the forefront of our minds. We need answers to that question from the administration, and we're going to continue to hold the administration accountable to make significant improvements. So I look forward to hearing from the witnesses on how they are prioritizing these kids, and I'd like to yield the last minute I have to the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Kennedy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Quote, every heartbeat hurts, end quote. Quote, I can't feel my heart, end quote. Quote, child was under the delusion that his father had been killed and believed that he would also be killed, end quote. These are the words included in an Inspector General report released earlier this month, which tell the sickening story of this administration's family separation policy. Kids fleeing unimaginable violence and poverty and destitution, arriving at our border to claim asylum and experiencing trauma in our nation's name. Think about that for a minute. What they endured, what they fled, that they left a life where gangs indiscriminately killed family members and neighbors, where meals were scarce and violence constant. And they made it here, to the United States of America, a beacon, shining city of global light and freedom and opportunity for good. The relief they must have felt touching our soil. And that is what they got. Those children, those babies, those toddlers will forever carry those scars with them. I look forward to getting some answers today. Yield back.
And I yield back, Madam
yields
Chair.
back. Chair now recognizes the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Walden, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair DeGette. Thanks for holding this hearing. I want to thank our panel of witnesses here. Some of you have been here before. We're appreciative of the work you and your teams are doing. We know it's a tough job. We look forward to continuing to work with you. As Republican Leader Guthrie stated, this committee conducted oversight of the Office of Refugee Resettlement and Unaccompanied Alien Children program since 2014. We saw a lot of problems in the Obama administration and mistakes that were made there, and have tried to learn from those and not repeat them. Last Congress, I and every Republican member of this committee sent a letter to HHS seeking information from ORR to ensure that children who are in ORR's custody, whether they crossed the border as an unaccompanied child or because they were separated from a parent or legal guardian during the Zero Tolerance Initiative, are properly cared for while in ORR's care. I also led a bipartisan delegation of members down to McAllen, Texas, a year ago in July to visit and tour part of the southwest border. I wanted to see it firsthand. We looked at the central processing facility operated by CBP and an ORR shelter. My staff also visited 5 additional ORR facilities, including the temporary influx facility in Tornillo, Texas, that closed at the end of last year. Earlier this summer, overwhelming numbers of migrants crossed the southwest border. This border crisis more than taxed the resources of every agency involved at each point in the process, and that includes CBP and ORR. So I wanted to see for myself again how CBP was handling this new surge of people at our southwest border. So I visited the CBP facility in Yuma, Arizona. By the time I had arrived in Yuma, Congress had finally exceeded the President's request for emergency funding, which I supported. I was the only one in the Oregon delegation to do so. And Yuma had a temporary processing facility in addition to the regular station. But just weeks before, the facility had been overwhelmed, at one point holding more than 1,600 migrants, including UACs. CBP agents I met with, they answered every single question I had, and they talked to me about the difficulties they face. They also showed me every part of the facility, even the storage rooms, which were filled with fresh diapers and clothing and food and other supplies. I also took a helicopter tour of the border, seeing parts of the Yuma sector that are so remote that air travel is necessary to efficiently and effectively patrol it. And I saw a cave on the top of a mountain where a cartel scout had lived for months, helping traffickers bring people and contraband into the United States illegally. And I saw the different types of border barriers in place in the Yuma sector, some of which are extremely ineffective at stopping people from entering the United States. Now, on that same trip, I also traveled to Carrizo Springs, Texas, to see the ORR-funded temporary influx shelter that was operational at that time. And as with other ORR-funded facilities, I and my staff have seen the children there were very well cared for. They received not just food and shelter, but also medical, educational, and counseling services. But was this too little, too late? This summer, before ORR was able to open Carrizo Springs, unaccompanied children spent far too long in CBP facilities, more than the 72 hours mandated by the Flores settlement. CBP agents in Yuma told me that at the peak of the crisis, children stayed in their Border Patrol facility for 7 to 10 days, and nobody thought that was acceptable, but they were overwhelmed. Unlike ORR facilities, CBP facilities are not meant to house children. It's critical that we move them into more appropriate facilities as quickly as possible. These immigration and border security issues are complex and something Congress has grappled with for decades. I've always been clear I support strong enforcement of our nation's borders. A country that doesn't have control of its borders does not have control of its security. And children in the care of the federal government, no matter where they are in the process or how they arrived here, should be treated as if they were our own children. So I'm pleased we have 2 of the agencies involved in the apprehension of the UACs before us today. We should note that they do not represent the full process, and it would be nice sometime in this committee if we could have the entire chain here of agencies involved, so we saw a clear and full picture. I hope that HHS and CBP will also update us today on how they're using the funds provided by Congress earlier this year in the emergency supplemental, which the President requested and I supported, and how each agency is preparing for a likely increase in migrants in the coming months. We know there would be a drop-off in the extremely hot times in the summer, but we also know there will be a pickup. While immigration numbers are difficult to predict, there are patterns, and we must learn from this summer's crisis. And I also echo Republican Leader Guthrie's call for solutions. If there are legislative changes your agencies need from us, please let us know. If you need resources, as you requested earlier this year, let us know. So I thank our witnesses for being here, for the work you and your teams do, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now asks unanimous consent that the members' written opening statements be made part of the record without objection, so ordered. I now would like to introduce the witnesses for today's hearing. Ms. Ann Maxwell, Assistant Inspector General for Evaluation and Inspections, Office of Evaluation and Inspections, Office of Inspector General, U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Mr. Jonathan Hayes, Director, Office of Refugee Resettlement, Administration for Children and Families, U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Commander Jonathan White, United States Public Health Service Commission Corps, U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. And Chief John R. Maudlin, Acting Deputy Chief of Law Enforcement Operational Programs, Law Enforcement Operations Directorate, U.S. Border Patrol, U.S. Customs and Border Protection, U.S. Department of Homeland Security. Don't worry, we won't use the entire titles of each of you every time we ask you a question. But I do want to thank each one of you for appearing today. It's important that we hear all of your testimony. And I'm sure all of you are aware, this committee takes hearings, it's an investigative hearing, and so we have the practice of taking testimony under oath. Does anyone have an objection to testifying under oath? Let the record reflect that the witnesses have responded no. The chair then advises you that under the rules of the House and the rules of the committee, you're entitled to be accompanied by counsel. Does anybody wish to be accompanied by counsel today? Let the record reflect the witnesses have responded no. If you would then, please rise and raise your right hand so you may be sworn in. Do you swear the testimony that you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Let the record reflect that the witnesses have responded affirmatively, and you may be seated. You are all now under oath and subject to the penalties set forth under Title 18, Section 1001 of the U.S. Code. And the chair will now recognize our witnesses for a 5-minute summary of their written statements. In front of you is a microphone and a series of lights. The light will turn yellow when you have a minute left, and it'll turn red to indicate that your time has come to an end. Ms. Maxwell, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chair DeGette and Ranking Member Guthrie and other distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss OIG's ongoing oversight of the Unaccompanied Alien Children Program administered by the Office of Refugee Resettlement. Today, I will be focusing on our findings regarding challenges ORR-funded facilities face in addressing the mental health needs of children in their care. These facilities serve migrant children who arrive in the U.S. on their own or who are separated from their parents by immigration officials. These children have often experienced intense trauma before coming into ORR care, which is why prompt medical health treatment is not only required by ORR, but is essential for children's well-being. My testimony reflects what we heard firsthand from facility staff across the country about the obstacles they face. We were told that there are a number of systemic challenges that make it difficult for staff to address the mental health needs of children. These include the ability to employ and support clinical staff. Mental health clinicians reported heavy caseloads. They also asked for more training and support to treat traumatized children. In addition, staff faced difficulties accessing specialty care, such as psychologists and psychiatrists, to treat children with greater needs. In one example, the only bilingual specialist a facility could find was located in another state. Finally, staff reported a lack of therapeutic placement options within ORR's network, equipped to treat children who needed a higher level of care. This was especially acute for children who needed secure therapeutic settings due to their history of behavioral problems. To address these systemic challenges, we recommend that ORR leverage expertise and resources within HHS and the broader mental health community to ensure facilities have sufficient clinical staff who are fully supported and are able to access the needed specialty care for children. These systemic challenges, according to facility staff, were exacerbated by policy changes made in 2018. In the spring of 2018, the Department of Homeland Security formally adopted the zero-tolerance policy of criminally prosecuting all adults for illegal entry and placing their children in ORR facilities. Facilities reported that addressing the needs of children who had been separated from their parents unexpectedly was particularly challenging because these children exhibited more fear, feelings of abandonment, and post-traumatic stress than did children who were not separated. One medical director told us separated children would present physical symptoms as manifestations of their psychological pain. These children would say their chest hurt even though there was medically nothing wrong with them. One child said, "Every heartbeat hurts." These children didn't understand why they were separated. As a result, some were angry, believing their parents had abandoned them. Others were anxious, concerned for their parents' safety. And as we've heard, one 8-year-old boy separated from his father was under the delusion that his father had been killed and that he was next, and he required emergency psychiatric care. Caring for separated children was additionally challenging because they were often younger than the teenagers the facilities were used to serving. Staff reported that younger children had shorter attention spans, needed greater supervision, and were more commonly exhibited defiance and other negative behaviors. They couldn't always accurately communicate. The little ones, as one program director said, don't know how to express what they are feeling. Other policy changes that occurred in 2018 involved the process for discharging children to sponsors. ORR added new screening requirements and started sharing sponsor information with immigration officials. Staff noted that these changes led to longer stays in care for children, and that had a negative effect on their behavior and their mental health. They said that even children who entered care with good coping skills became disillusioned as their time in care dragged on, resulting in higher levels of hopelessness, frustration, and more instances of self-harm. While the policy changes made in 2018 have largely been reversed, facilities continue to serve separated children, as well as children who are not quickly discharged from care. To address these continuing challenges and ensure that children are not unnecessarily harmed, we recommend that ORR continue to reassess whether its current policies are negatively impacting children in any way and adjust as needed. We also recommend that ORR establish guardrails that ensure that future policy changes prioritize child welfare considerations above all other competing demands. Thank you to the committee for the opportunity to present this information and your ongoing support of our oversight work. I am happy to address any questions.
Thank you so much, Ms. Maxwell. Chair now recognizes Mr. Hayes for 5 minutes for purposes of an opening statement.
Thank you, Chair DeGette, Ranking Member Guthrie, and members of the subcommittee. It is my honor to appear today on behalf of the Department of Health and Human Services. My name is Jonathan Hayes, and as the Director of the Office of Refugee Resettlement, I oversee the Unaccompanied Alien Children Program. I became the permanent director earlier this year, and it is a privilege to serve in this role alongside the ORR career staff. I am continually impressed with the level of commitment and professionalism that I see in the ORR career staff and our grantees on a daily basis. The caring culture of ORR directly impacts our day-to-day operations and goals, as well as the staff who carry out our round-the-clock operations of service of some of the world's most vulnerable children. I have visited over 50 UAC care providers over the last year so that I can see firsthand the quality of care that the ORR staff and grantees provide to the UAC. I also heard the perspectives and input from our field team, which allowed me to better understand ways to improve our services and overall mission. My strong desire is to ensure the safety and well-being of the children in our care in a manner that is consistent with both the law and the prevailing child welfare best practices, and one that empowers the career professionals and senior staff at ORR. As the director of ORR, I am committed to making decisions that are in the best interest of each child in ORR's care and custody. Prior to my time at ORR, I worked for 2 members of the House of Representatives for approximately 8 years, and that experience provided me important perspective into the important oversight role that you and your staff have in ensuring that federal programs operate successfully. I apologize. In the Homeland Security Act of 2002, or the HSA, Congress placed the responsibility of care for UAC with ORR. The Homeland Security Act defines an unaccompanied alien child as a person under the age of 18 with no lawful immigration status and without a parent or legal guardian present in the United States available to provide for the care and custody of the child. Once an apprehending agency determines that the child is a UAC, that agency is responsible for referring the child to ORR. Congress instructed ORR to ensure that the best interests of the child are considered when providing care and custody for children. All of us at ORR take this responsibility to heart and work every day to ensure the safety and well-being of the children in our care. To that end, based on the provisions of the Homeland Security Act, the Trafficking Victim Protection Reauthorization Act of 2008, and the provisions of the Flores Settlement Agreement, HHS has built a network of dedicated care providers, developed rules and standards for care for those providers, and created mechanisms of oversight to ensure compliance. HHS's role in the lives of UAC is often misunderstood. HHS does not apprehend migrants at the border or enforce immigration laws. The Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Justice perform those functions. ORR does not have jurisdiction over children that arrive with an adult parent. DHS is responsible for those families. HHS's UAC program is a humanitarian child welfare program designed for the temporary care of children until they can be safely released or unified with family or other sponsors. The number of UAC entering the United States during this fiscal year has risen to levels we have never seen before. As of September 16th of this year, DHS has referred more than 67,000 UAC to us at ORR, which is the highest number in the program's history. By comparison, HHS received just over 59,000 referrals in fiscal year 2016, which is the second highest number on record. ORR operates nearly 170 state-licensed care provider facilities and programs in 23 states. ORR has different types of facilities in order to meet the different needs of the minors in our care. HHS is again deeply committed to the physical and emotional well-being of all children temporarily in our care. Staff at our care providers are trained in techniques for child-friendly and trauma-informed interviewing, ongoing assessment, observation, and treatment of the medical and behavioral health needs of the children, including those who have been separated from their parents. Care provider staff are trained to identify children who have been smuggled and or trafficked into the United States. Care providers must provide services that are sensitive to the age, culture, and native language of each child. ORR provides a wide range of medical services to the children in our care. These services include a complete medical examination, routine medical and dental care, and emergency health services. Mental health services are available at all of our facilities. ORR policy requires at a minimum that the UAC and ORR state licensed facilities receive an individual counseling session and 2 group counseling sessions with a clinician every week. Additional mental health services are available as needed. I believe that a child should not remain in ORR care any longer than the time needed to find an appropriate sponsor. A central part of ORR's mission is to discharge children from care as quickly as possible while ensuring their safety. As of the end of August of this year, the average length of time that a child stays in HH's custody is approximately 50 days, which is a dramatic decrease of over 40% from late November 2018, when the average length of care was 90 days. ORR will continue to assess the efficiency of its operations to improve the process for release and reduce the time a child remains in our care and custody. Again, my top priority of me and my team is the safety and well-being of the children in the temporary care of HHS as we work quickly and safely to release them to a suitable sponsor. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss our important work. I'll be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you so much, Mr. Hayes. I now recognize Commander White for 5 minutes for purposes of an opening statement. Commander.
Chairwoman DeGette, Ranking Member Guthrie, and members of the subcommittee, it's my honor to speak again before you today on behalf of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. My name is Jonathan White. I'm a career officer in the U.S. Public Health Service Commission Corps. I'm also a social worker and emergency manager. I previously served as the Deputy Director of ORR, the senior career official over the UAC program. And more recently, I served as HHS's operational lead for the interagency mission to reunify children in ORR care who had been separated from their parents at the border. Shortly after the Mizell court issued its orders, Secretary Azar directed HHS and the incident management team, which I led in particular, to take all reasonable actions to comply. The IMT worked closely with Department of Homeland Security, including CBP, and our colleagues at ICE to try to identify all parents of children in ORR care who potentially met the court's criteria for class membership. And as a result, the current reporting of possible children of potential Mizell class members to the Mizell court is 2,814 children. To be clear, that count of 2,814 children does not include children who had already been discharged by ORR before June 26, 2018, nor does it include separated children referred to ORR care after that date. Working in close partnership with colleagues in ICE, DOJ, and the Department of State, we first worked to reunify children who had parents in ICE custody. This was an unprecedented effort. It required a novel process which we developed and which the court approved. And under the compressed schedule required by court order of 15 days for children under the age of 5 and 30 days for children aged 5 to 17, we reunified 1,441 children with parents in ICE custody. All of the children of eligible and available Mizell class members who are in ICE custody. For children whose parents had been released to the interior of the United States, we implemented an expedited reunification process. For parents who had departed the United States, the ACLU, which serves as plaintiff's counsel for the Mizell class member parents, obtained from those parents their desire either to have the child reunified with them in home country or to waive reunification so the child could undergo standard ORR sponsorship process. And once we received the parents' desire for reunification, HHS, DHS, and DOJ coordinated with the ACLU, with the government of the home country, and with the child's family to ensure safe reunification into the care of the parents. Of the 2,814 children reported to the Mizell court, as of September 6th, 2,787 have been discharged from ORR care. We reunified 2,168 of them with the parent from whom they were separated. Another 619 children have left ORR care through other appropriate discharges. There are 12 children still in ORR care whose parents are outside the U.S. and have waived reunification. There are 4 children in care who we later determined hadn't been separated. There are 8 children in ORR care who were separated, but we cannot reunify them because we've made a final determination that the parent poses a clear danger to the safety of the child based on sound social work child welfare methods. There's 1 child in care whose parents are in the U.S. and have waived reunification. There's 1 child left for whom the ACLU has advised the resolution of the parent's wishes will be delayed. 1 child from the ACLU could not obtain the parent's preference. As of April 25th of this year, the court also approved our plan to identify those children who'd been separated from DHS starting on July 1st, 2017, referred to ORR, but had already been discharged pursuant to the TVPRA process before June 26, 2018. Teams of U.S. Public Health Service Commission Corps officers reporting to me have completed manual review of the UAC portal, the UAC program's official record, case file review for every child whose referral and discharge dates fell in that range. We resolved to err on the side of inclusiveness in identifying any potential preliminary indication of separation. In weekly lists, that data went from HHS first to CBP, then to ICE, where they could conduct their own manual records, and we since have been providing the ACLU on a rolling basis with lists of possible children of potential class members, and as of today, we have provided 7 lists to the ACLU comprising 989 possible children of potential class members. The judge has given the government until October 25th to provide the ACLU information on all the possible children of potential class members, and at this time, I anticipate we will meet his deadline. The UAC program's mission is a child welfare mission, and this has guided us also in our mission to reunify children, to place every child where we can back in their parents' arms, or to safely discharge that child to another family sponsor when that's a parent's wish or when it's in the best interest of the child. Thank you. I'll be glad to answer any questions that you may have for me.
Thank you so much, Commander White. Now I'm pleased to recognize Chief Maudlin for 5 minutes for purposes of an opening statement. Chief.
Thank you, Chair DeGette, Ranking Member Guthrie, and members of the subcommittee. I'm honored to represent the men and women of the Border Patrol before you today. The phenomenon of unaccompanied alien children, or UACs, crossing our border illegally is relatively new in the 95-year history of the Border Patrol. In an unprecedented surge in fiscal year 2014, Border Patrol encountered more than 68,000 UACs along the southwest border. With just a few weeks remaining in this fiscal year, we have already surpassed 74,000. This year's record-setting UAC numbers did not happen in a vacuum. At the same time, Border Patrol apprehended more than 289,000 single adults and 465,000 individuals in family units, surpassing total southwest border apprehensions for every year since 2007. This volume and mix of demographics overwhelmed Border Patrol capabilities like nothing we have ever seen. UAC is a term defined in law, and any child who is apprehended without a parent or legal guardian is processed by Border Patrol as a UAC. Additionally, Congress has assigned HHS as the lead agency to provide care and custody for UACs until sponsors can be identified. Therefore, while Border Patrol is the first to encounter UACs when they cross the border, our role is limited. Beginning when agents apprehend a UAC in the field, we provide transportation to a Border Patrol station, conduct initial processing to prepare an immigration file and a referral to HHS, and arrange transfer to HHS once placement is confirmed. To accomplish these steps as quickly as possible, generally within 72 hours, agents prioritize UAC for processing, followed by family units, and then single adults. As we saw earlier this summer, this process only works when both Border Patrol and HHS have the needed capacity. Border Patrol has no way of knowing how many UACs we will apprehend in any location on any day, and we cannot transfer UACs to the custody of any governmental or non-governmental organization other than HHS. This means the Border Patrol has no control over when UACs come into our custody or how quickly they transfer out. Therefore, we are incredibly reliant on the capacity of HHS. On May 1st, HHS asked Congress for $2.8 billion in emergency supplemental funding because they could not maintain the level of shelter space needed. They announced they would be cutting services to prioritize remaining funds for basic care. Also in May, Border Patrol saw the highest month of UAC apprehensions in our history. Combined, Border Patrol's rapid increase in apprehensions and HHS's funding challenges resulted in UACs remaining in our custody far longer than they should. By early June, this backup led to as many as 2,700 UACs in Border Patrol custody. Additional resources didn't arrive until early July after Congress passed the supplemental. Now, with HHS fully funded and apprehensions on the decline, we are down to only 100 to 200 UACs in our custody, and we're generally transferring them to HHS within 24 to 30 hours. All of us here today agree that a Border Patrol station is not an appropriate place for a child. For the limited time they're in our custody, our processing facilities are set up only to meet the basic necessities of food, water, and shelter. Available space is challenged by the need to safely hold children apart from unrelated adults and appropriately grouped by age and gender. The best thing we can do for these children is to expedite their transfer to the kind of comprehensive care and services that HHS is set up to provide. All of what I've described speaks only to the treatment and care of children once they are in our custody of the U.S. During interviews, agents are often told horror stories from the journey. Border Patrol sees the cruelty of smugglers firsthand. Agents have rescued more than 550 children so far this year. We need to focus more on how to discourage parents from sending their children on this dangerous journey. The unique treatment of UACs under our laws, particularly those from non-contiguous countries, is currently being interpreted as guaranteed admission if a child crosses the border before their 18th birthday. Smugglers are capitalizing on this perception, even using it as a tactic. Just 2 weeks ago, agents identified 2 Mexican adult males who posed as Guatemalan teenagers to avoid detention. One man admitted outright that the smugglers told him this would ensure his release into the U.S. A few days later, the diligent work of our agents led to the identification of a 23-year-old Bangladeshi man posing as a UAC. This trend is concerning. In total, more than 316,000 children have been apprehended along the southwest border, either as UACs or as part of family units this year. More parents are being convinced by smugglers to bring or send their children on this dangerous journey under the belief that children, and anyone with children, will be released into the U.S. under our laws. While additional funding for temporary facilities, consumables, and medical support have improved our ability to respond to this crisis, there is simply no substitute for congressional action to address these pull factors in our immigration framework. I thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Chief Modlin, and thanks to the entire panel for your testimony. Chair now recognizes herself for purposes of questioning for 5 minutes. During our February hearing on family separations, we heard from child welfare experts about the decades of research showing that family separations lead to toxic stress and result in long-term traumatic consequences. And in fact, Ms. Maxwell, your investigation seemed to confirm our worst fears about the harms that this cruel separation policy had on the children. According to the program directors and mental health clinicians who cared for the separated children, these children exhibited more fear, feelings of abandonment, and post-traumatic stress than children who were not separated. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And you also found that children who believed their parents who abandoned them were angry and confused. Some children expressed feelings of fear or guilt and even became concerned for their parents' welfare, and some children expressed acute grief that caused them to cry inconsolably. Is that correct?
That's what we heard from the mental health clinicians that took care of these children, yes.
Now, one program director told you that and several of us talked about a 7 or 8 year old boy who was separated from his father without any explanation was under the delusion that his father had been killed, and he also thought that he would be killed. The child had to receive emergency psychiatric care to address his mental health needs. Is that correct?
Yes, that's what we heard.
And one medical director told you how physical symptoms felt by separated children are manifestations of their psychological pain, and that separated children would often say their chest hurt when in fact they were actually medically fine. And they said, as Congressman Kennedy said, they said, quote, "Every heartbeat hurts, and I can't feel my heart." Is that correct?
Again, that is what we heard from the staff that treat the children.
Now,
yes.
Commander White, in February, you told us that you had raised concerns with HHS leadership about what a family separation policy would mean for children and the capacity of the program. And some of the documents that we got from HHS show that while this was all going on, you were increasingly raising the alarm about separations within HHS. So I want to just make a guess here that you're not really surprised about some of these findings in the IG's report about the reactions of the children.
The findings in HHS OIG's report are absolutely consistent with what all the best available evidence and science would tell us that we should anticipate when children experience the traumatic event of separation from parents. Unfortunately, we have extensive scientific research that would allow us to know what we would expect to see. The consequences of this for the child's health and behavioral health are severe. The risks are profound, and the effects are often lifelong.
So that was what I wanted to follow up with you, is we heard from the experts back before and now from Ms. Maxwell about the immediate manifestations, but in your professional experience, what's the prognosis, the lifelong prognosis for these kids?
The prognosis for each child will be very different.
Obviously.
However, what we know about the particular trauma of prolonged separation of a child from a parent is that children both are at lifetime risk for trauma-related mental health problems and also a whole set of toxic stress-created effects that can have lifetime effects on them cognitively, in terms of their cardiac health. Overall, the consequences for many of these children, even if they are able to receive robust clinical services, will be quite severe, and this speaks to the harm that is involved when you have separation of children except strictly for cause.
Thank you. Chief Maudlin, I was glad to hear that the amount of time that it's taking to transfer the children from CBP to ORR has decreased now. But something that I talked to several people about over the summer is what kind of guidance the Border Patrol was being given when they are taking these children into custody before they can be transferred. Has there been a coordination between CBP and ORR about the minimum conditions that need to be given to the children?
Chair, I'm a little unclear on the question. Is the question about the guidance given at the separation, or whatever's the coordination between CBP and HHS?
Well, my time's expired, so I'll explore this later. But this is what I'm just shocked by: is the reports that I saw, that I mentioned in my opening statement, about children wearing dirty diapers, about them not getting not getting showers or cleanliness, about 6- and 7-year-olds having to take care of infants and toddlers. And what I'm just wondering is, because of the different agencies that we've got, if CBP didn't get guidance from ORR about the standards that you have to have for children. So my time's expired, but I will ask you more about that later. I'll now recognize the ranking member, Mr. Guthrie, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for the recognition, and I'll start. Commander White, you were before this subcommittee last February. One of the issues that you discussed at the hearing was whether HHS received adequate information from CBP when a child is separated from a parent or legal guardian. Is HHS now receiving sufficient information from CBP when a child is separated? And what steps is ORR taking from a policy or technology perspective to ensure ORR is receiving sufficient information?
Respectfully, Congressman, I'll defer to Mr. Hayes, since he currently directs ORR and I don't work there anymore.
Thank you, Commander. Yes, Congressman, we do have a specific team now inside of the Office of Refugee Resettlement, with both public health service officers that are inside of ORR, as well as senior career officials that track very closely the number of separations that we have since June 27th, after the court injunction last year. These are separations for cause. We get updates every couple of weeks, and we do have a very close monitoring of this. And there are questions that our intakes team will go back and forth with at times with CBP to get additional information. But the information that we're receiving from CBP is allowing us to keep a close track of this record, and we are.
Thank you. And so Director Hayes as well, do you believe there's a need for Congress to clarify when it is and isn't okay to separate a child? Or OR sponsors evaluation policies and procedures an appropriate guide for CBP agents to determine when to separate a child? And would these same policies and procedures be a good guide for legislation to clarify the issue?
Yeah, I would answer that question two ways, Congressman. I think some additional clarity or clear boundaries or guardrails, as Ann Maxwell suggested, would be wise, but this also gets into the area of law enforcement, and I would defer to my colleagues at CBP on that.
Do you think that Congress should clarify when it's appropriate for you to separate a child?
Sir, the times that children are separated right now, which has existed throughout my 24 years in the Border Patrol, are guided by the results of the Miss L case. So we're already following the outcome of that case, sir.
My understanding it under the zero tolerance policy, that was legal to do. The law, that was zero tolerance was we're enforcing the law without prosecutorial discretion. So Congress could clarify that you can't separate a child from a parent or legal guardian if the infraction is merely an immigration violation. Congress
Yes, sir.
could clarify that. And right now you can do that under the law. Not that you're doing it, but you can do it under the law.
Yes, sir. As I'm sure you're aware, the zero tolerance prosecution initiative was to prosecute everyone that crossed the border illegally for violation of 8 U.S.C. 1325.
Right.
After the executive order on maintaining family unity, those processes were stopped, and now we follow the guidance of the Miss L litigation.
Right. Well, you don't have to add, but Congress could clarify that, is my point. So, Chief Modlin, this year we've seen a record number of migrants apprehended at the southwest border. The system was completely unprepared to handle this. How did CBP work with HHS at the height of this crisis to move children out of CBP facilities into OR facilities as quickly as possible?
So what I would first like to say, sir, is that the men and women of the Border Patrol are professional and compassionate. We follow the guidelines that are set forth in our TEDS policy that's been spoken about many times in these hearings, the Flores litigation, TVPRA, PREA. In addition to that, at the height of this crisis, our communication with HHS, as I'm sure you're aware, is always difficult. As a law enforcement agency communicating with a non-law enforcement agency, our systems can't speak directly to each other for many reasons, that being one of them. But we put procedures in place to get as much of the pertinent information that we could to HHS while preventing the law enforcement sensitive information from going forward, and at the same time not receiving information from them that they wouldn't want to go to a law enforcement agency.
This may be more for Director Hayes, but Chief Mullen, because you brought it up, Congress spent, I guess from sometime early, I don't know the exact date, sometime early May to right before the 4th of July break, the administration begging for a supplemental funding bill because of the crisis at the border. You said that you've had relief, Chief Mullen, because of the supplemental. We wasted about 2 months arguing for I don't know what about getting a bill to the floor to help you out. So how has that improved? What issues did that cause, and how has that improved since you've had it passed, and when Congress has been late getting it to you?
Yes, sir, Congressman. So what you say is correct. There was a delay in getting us the additional supplemental funding that we requested. I don't remember the exact timeline, but there was a period where we entered into
at least 6 weeks.
Deficiency. Yeah, there was a period where we entered into a deficiency, meaning we knew we would not make it to the end of the fiscal year with our current appropriation. That absolutely created a potential limitation on some services, created a lot of uncertainty in the program and across our grantees, many of which are very small, non-for-profit facilities and programs that don't have a lot of resources other than the grants that we give them to care for these children. So once we got those resources, it absolutely brought certainty and gave us the additional resources we needed.
Thanks. My time's expired. Now you go back. Thank you.
Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Kennedy, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Chief Modlin, just to begin with you, you said that there was challenges getting your systems because you're a law enforcement agency to interact with HHS. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
Do your systems include a telephone?
I'm sorry?
Do your systems include a telephone?
Yes, telephones are used to contact that agency. So
And how about email?
What cannot pass back and forth is law enforcement sensitive information. So IT solutions that are normally a solution between non-law enforcement entities.
Understood, sir, but that could be perhaps a telephone call saying, hey, we've got a crisis, this needs to stop, this needs to change. Did those conversations happen?
Absolutely, sir. They happen between the agency. They happen from our leadership to Congress. They happen from our leadership to the press. Absolutely, those conversations took place, sir.
I don't believe that's what evidence has indicated from prior testimony here, from prior hearings, but we'll get back to that in a second. Ms. Maxwell, I'd like to talk to you more about the impact of the 2018 family separation policy on ORR's ability to care for our children in their custody. Your report found that OR care providers found it particularly challenging to provide age-appropriate mental health services for the very young and the many very young children it had to care for because of the forced separation policy by this administration. Ms. Maxwell, is that correct?
That's correct, what we heard.
Ms. Maxwell, in fact, you found in your report that the number of young children, which you defined as 12 and younger, requiring ORR care increased sharply in May of 2018 when DHS formally began implementing a zero-tolerance policy that led to family separation. Is that correct?
That's correct.
In fact, your report notes that, quote, faced with a sudden and dramatic increase in young children, staff reported feeling challenged to care for children who presented different needs from the teenagers that they typically served. Is that correct?
Indeed, it is.
Ms. Maxwell, briefly, what were some of those challenges?
I think there's two things to keep in mind when we think about the increase in the younger children in OR population. The first, as you mentioned, is the dramatic increase. We were looking at over 164% increase from April to May of the 6 to 12-year-olds, and 80% increase from April to May for the 0 to 5. So just the dramatic and sudden increase was a challenge in and of itself. And then, of course, the younger children presented different needs. As I mentioned, they have shorter attention spans, they need more supervision, and they can't always communicate. So the normal methods and modalities of treatment are different for a younger population than for the teenagers the facilities are used to treating.
And Ms. Maxwell, to quote you you quote an OR program director in your report who said, quote, a 7 or 8-year-old boy was separated from his father without any explanation as to why the separation occurred. The child was under the delusion that his father had been killed and believed that he would also be killed. This child ultimately required emergency psychiatric care to address his mental health distress. Ms. Maxwell, is it common for separated children to face serious mental health issues?
We heard that from the staff that treat them, that they were more difficult, more challenging to treat because of the separation than children who weren't separated.
And Commander White, this is your area of expertise. What kind of challenges did the separations pose to the providers who had to care for those children?
So the separated children pose really sort of multiple problems for program providers, some of which are simply capacitation issues. But to focus, if I understand your question, to focus narrowly on the additional clinical requirements. While the ORR program providers are trauma-informed programs, the level of trauma and the type of trauma experienced by unaccompanied children really is dwarfed by the reality of separated children. Separated children's needs are very different in 4 important ways. First, their trauma is uniformly recent. Second, it is currently ongoing. It's not a past event. That separation is happening right now in the moment. Third, it involves a disruption of family systems that are very different from what we see from unaccompanied children. And third, and most importantly, it is very difficult for the child to distinguish that the people there, such as the clinician in the shelter, are not part of the separation process. They see us as one government and one entity, so their ability to establish therapeutic rapport and to benefit from clinical intervention is much less. Separated children cannot be served effectively in an ORR UAC program setting.
Commander, if I remember your testimony from your prior appearance here, you indicated that, did you get advance notice of a family separation policy before you started seeing an increase in separated children?
We did not receive any notice of a policy prior to its announcement on television.
Which was after the policy was in place.
Correct. Discussions of possible future policy options, which would include separation, began in February of 2017. We began to observe significant, essentially a 10-fold increase in separation over historic norms beginning in July of 2017.
And presumably, your phones and emails were working at that point too. You could have received a phone call from anybody within the administration announcing this policy change.
At the field level, coordination between ORR's intakes desk and CBP border stations is an everyday process and is very robust.
Yield back.
Okay, Commander, just to clarify, during those conversations about a potential separation policy in 2017, you continually raised the red flag that this would be detrimental to the children. Isn't that correct?
My consistent recommendation, and that of the entire ORR career team, was that separation of children from family units and their designation as UAC would pose an unacceptable danger to the child, and moreover, would pose a set of capacity problems that would overwhelm the program operationally.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Walden, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks again for having this hearing. And once again, I want to be unequivocal, too. None of us supported this child separation policy. We agree with your leadership and that of your career team on this matter. And Madam Chair, thanks again for having this hearing. I'm sorry I had to step upstairs. They're having one on pharmaceutical drugs. And as I said up there, and I'll say here before I get into this issue, I beg of the majority to share with us the legislation that's going to completely rewrite pharmaceutical law in America. We've just been told there's a hearing already scheduled for next Wednesday. There's no legislative text, and we've been completely excluded from the process. It's all been written in the Speaker's office. And our committee has a proud and thorough tradition of working together on these issues.
I would certainly give it to you if I had written it, don't worry.
And I know you would. That's because I know the work you've done on cures in a bipartisan way and on creates and other things. And this doesn't have to be this way. We have a great tradition of working together. Got a lot of good brains on both sides of the committee. This is a common issue we need to tackle like this one is. And so I'm deeply disappointed. We'll maybe get one witness next Wednesday and no time to prepare, no view of the legislative text. Thank you. Now, let me get on to this. When I was down in Yuma, Chief Maudlin, we looked at the facility. Your team, by the way, was terrific. Anything I asked, they answered. They didn't try and stop me from seeing anything. By the way, we had followed the rules, planned ahead of time, worked with your folks. They were terrific. And I want to tell you that. They were very accommodating and did a great job. But what they did tell me that was really a disturbing piece of this puzzle was about the challenges they faced in identifying false families, and that they had encountered, not a lot, but enough, adults who were pretending to be the parent of a minor child in hopes of being released into the United States. One agent told us about a father who was apprehended with an infant child that he claimed to be his. And while the Border Patrol agent strongly suspected he was not actually the father, they had no way to prove this. Another agent told me about an ongoing prosecution where children were paired with adults, and this is important for our committee to hear, paired with adults multiple times, same kids, multiple times, to create false family units. And after the purported family unit entered the United States, was apprehended and released, the child was sent back out of the country and made the journey over again. So my question is, how frequently do CBP patrol agents encounter these types of situations? I cannot imagine the trauma those poor children go through, where an adult claims to be the parent of a minor but isn't. How difficult is it for you and your team to ferret these traffickers, I'll call them, these abusers, which is what they are. And my God, what happens to those kids? Can you enlighten us? Because your team brought this to my attention.
Absolutely. Thank you, sir, for the question. What I can say is, to your point, it is very difficult to discern that, especially if you can put yourself in the position of the Border Patrol agents in those crowded facilities during that time, during the height of this crisis. What I can tell you is that the diligent work of the men and women of the Border Patrol, their attention to detail, they're caring for these children. They recognize when things aren't right between what's purported to be a family member and a child. They notice things that don't occur in a normal familial situation. To date, we have identified more than 6,100 individuals that have made fraudulent claims as to being a family member in order to gain the benefit that you speak of. And
6,100 individuals?
Over 6,100, sir, yes. And that's just what the Border Patrol has found. As I'm sure you're aware, that ICE HSI would be glad to talk to. They investigate these same claims as well, and their numbers would be apart from the numbers that
You said ICE investigates these
ICE
claims?
HSI, yes, sir.
All right, because there are members of this body that want to eliminate the funding for ICE and wipe them out. So they would not be available to investigate this kind of human trafficking. That's my own statement. You don't have to comment on that. But 6,100. So how often are we seeing this recycling of the same kids where they're being abused and used and sent back and then they come back?
It's a daily occurrence, sir. What I would say to your earlier comment is that without the abilities of ICE to then further investigate these claims and find where the kids are being recycled, as you're talking about, where it is the children are being used as nothing more than a commodity in this. And this, of course, goes to the interior of the country, to locations where the cartels and these TCOs are using these kids over and over. ICE is critical for that. Without ICE, we would never be able to investigate and then prosecute those people.
All right, my time's expired. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Ruiz, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. As a father and a physician with training in humanitarian aid, I'm outraged not only by the inhumane family separation policies that derive from the zero tolerance policies, but the conditions that affect the mental health of migrant children while in the custody of our federal government. We've been talking and sounding the alarm before this report came out about toxic stress and how those extreme conditions without an infant's, a toddler's, a child's ability to be consoled by their parent aggravates this and will have permanent damage, not only to their ability to relate to others, but also in a physical form with diabetes, cardiac problems, and other ailments. And that's no condition that we want any child of ours or any of our neighbors to experience. And so let me get to some specific scenarios. Commander White, what does lack of sleep do to mental health? Because this is what this report is focused on, is the mental health of these children. What does lack of sleep do to the mental health of an individual?
So as you know, Dr. Ruiz, in both children, adolescents, and adults, lack of sleep both exacerbates behavioral health conditions and is a symptom of many behavioral health conditions.
An extreme lack of sleep can even lead to hallucinations.
Certainly.
And other psychoses, correct?
Certainly.
Okay, so now what if you get a child who has experienced traumatic events and you keep them in a freezing temperature, by about 56 degrees Fahrenheit, the light's always on, okay, constantly interrupted with noise during the night, lay them on a hard concrete floor in a room with these lights always on, in a crowded quarter. What would that do to a child's mental health?
So that would potentially be deleterious to a child's mental health, but to be clear, those conditions are nowhere present in any ORR facility.
Correct, but they are at CBP, and I've witnessed them. And this is an issue that we hear reports from children from many CBP facilities. So let me ask you, Chief Modlin, is it a policy to keep a room at that freezing temperature? Is it a policy intentionally that you're keeping the lights on 24/7? Is it a policy that you do routine, spontaneous checks to wake up children who are laying on a crowded floor in close quarters? Is it a policy from CBP? Is it intentional?
Doctor, I'm unaware of any freezing rooms.
I've been there, I've felt them in New Mexico, and I've heard reports from Yuma and El Centro.
Doctor, what I can tell you is that...
Is it, just answer my, is it a policy? Are you intentionally doing that? If it's not a policy, then would it be simple enough to make some changes?
Temperature is in accordance with the Flores settlement, sir.
Okay, well, they're 56 degrees Fahrenheit and it's freezing. Is it a policy to keep the lights on all night and interrupt their sleep?
Lights being on, sir, are a result of PREA, the Prison Rape Act.
Okay, so you need legislative changes to fix that, or can that be done administratively for the best interest of the children? Because the conditions right now that they're experiencing is promulgating and causing more harm to these children. Let me move on to another question. Director Hayes, is it in the best interest of a child to be detained in large facilities for long period of times, or is it in the best interest to place them in more individualistic approach to address their mental health care through foster homes and small group nonprofits?
So, Congressman, the desire of ORR in the best interest of child welfare concerns would be to have more smaller and medium-sized shelters and
so then why are you proposing to lease a large space that would warehouse many children in the Inland Empire, in my region, where it's 74,000 to 91,000 square feet to house and warehouse over 400 kids?
So, sir, you're referencing the efforts that we're underway right now with the GSA?
In the Inland Empire. Yep. You purposely are right now looking to house children and lease this for 17 years. Yep. And let me remind you that the border supplemental gave you $2.88 billion to the Office of Refugee Resettlement. That same border supplemental required the Department of Health and Human Services, or HHS, to, quote, prioritize use of community-based residential care, including long-term and transitional foster care and small group homes and shelter care other than large-scale institutional shelter facilities to house unaccompanied alien children in its custody, unquote. Why are you defying the law by searching for a 74 to 91,000 square foot warehouse facility to keep unaccompanied children in the Inland Empire.
All right, let me be clear, Congressman. We are looking at about 7 or 8 different locations around the country, and I want to be crystal clear, sir.
I don't care where they're at,
May I
as
answer
long
the
as they're
question?
not
I'd like to answer
large
the que-
warehouse facilities.
Yeah. May I answer the question, Chairwoman? Okay. I just want to be crystal clear for this committee. We are looking to expand our permanent state license network, and the cities that you mentioned in your area, as well as across the country, we are looking to find small to medium-sized shelters that will be state licensed by the respective states and towns that we reside
Yes,
in.
but housing them in
Gentleman's
intentionally
time has
17 years is
expired.
not in the best interest of the children.
The gentleman's time's expired. The chair now recognizes Mr. Burgess for 5 minutes.
Thank you. And Mr. Hayes, that is an important point because Chief Walden told us in his testimony that they don't have control over their population. The people that walk in and turn themselves in to Customs and Border Protection, they are obligated to process. They cannot send someone out who is under the age of 18 until you have an open bed for them.
That is correct, sir. And I just want to clarify, we are seeking to increase our foster care network. We are seeking to increase specialty type shelters. We are seeking to increase state licensed permanent network. And in order to timely accept these children when referred to us from DHS, we absolutely need the flexibility in both small, medium, and specialty type shelters in order to timely receive these children. That is our goal.
Right, because you've got to relieve the burden, the bottleneck that is occurring in Customs and Border Protection. They are not set up for the long term, anything longer than the very, very acute care of a child during the time that the processing occurs that Congress has determined that Customs and Border Protection shall provide. Now, there is some talk about maybe we don't need a law that prevents someone from coming into this country without authorization. I suppose that's a discussion that we're going to have during a presidential election year. But until Congress changes the law, Chief, you've got to follow the law, right?
Yes, absolutely, Congressman.
And really, one of the tragic situations of May and June of this year was you were caught. Mr. Hayes doesn't have any beds. Cartels are bringing people across the river, places that I visited in South Texas, the lower Rio Grande Valley in particular. They don't call you and say, hey, you got some incoming. You just have to be prepared to accept them, correct? At Pallone and Weslaco and all of the Customs Border Protection facilities?
Yes, sir.
And if they're out of space and you're out of money for disposables and things that you might need to take care of people, you're in a world of hurt, right?
Yes, sir, if I could. In fact, when the crisis was ramping up, we were expending our operational funds on those consumables, on diapers, on food, all those things that we were not prepared to deal with. And I believe it was your statement earlier about unclear on the time between the request and the appropriation. That was 57 days. 57 days at the height of this crisis that our agents were bringing in diapers from home. They were buying toys for these children. They were bringing in clothes to give these children. That's what the compassionate and professional men and women of the U.S. Border Patrol did on their own while we were waiting for action so that the capacity at HHS and further upstream could open up so that we could release all these subjects from our custody and get them to where they need to be.
And just for the record, I've made multiple trips over the past 12 or 14 months. I've been to McAllen 2 or 3 times. I've been to Brownsville, Casa Padre, went to Tornillo twice, was at Clint earlier this summer right after you got the supplemental funding. At the station, I guess it's called Ursula in Mission, Texas, I was there right at the end of May when you were at the height of the influx, and Mr. Hayes was unable to take the number of people that you had prepared to send them. And it was tough. I mean, it was tough sledding. It was hard on your men and women who work in Customs and Border Protection, Most of them have children themselves. You could see it in the eyes of Chief Garza when I was down there. This is hard on them, and they wanted Congress to do something, and you're caught. We won't help, and we're not allowed to secure the border. We won't provide you any additional funding, and guess what? It gets bad in a big hurry. I do just want to reference one thing, and Commander White, I respect the fact that there's a difference between a child who undergoes an acute separation, but I will tell you, in 2014, visiting the Weslaco station down in the Lower Rio Grande Valley sector, and at the time that the surge of unaccompanied minors was at one of its heights, and seeing the young boys that I saw sitting on cement benches, they weren't punching each other, they weren't pulling each other's hair, they were sitting staring straight ahead. Now, these were not children who had been there for a while, these are children who had just arrived that day. And it told me that the trauma that they endured on the trip up to the United States had to have been significant. They looked like victims of child abuse. I think that there is significant danger to children in making that journey, and Chief Modlin, you did an excellent job in your testimony. I encourage everybody to read that about the problems that are extant in the fact that we've got legislation and court decrees that do not make sense, and we need to straighten it out, and we need to do it. You can't do it.
Gentleman's time's
It can't be done
expired.
administratively. I yield back.
Chair now recognizes the gentlelady from New Hampshire, Ms. Custer, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. And I, too, have been to these facilities at the border, and these children are traumatized, and all the more reason to treat them with respect and not engage in furthering their trauma. So I think this is an incredibly important topic for us to be considering at this point, because these children are in our custody, and life is getting much worse for them with the trauma of separation. I was there with the mothers whose nursing babies had been ripped from their arms. So we've got to do better, and that's why Congress has acted to give you the resources that you need. I want to focus in on a very specific issue, if I could, which is with regard to sexual assault in the custody of our government. And following up on this report, which is devastating, I recommend it to everyone. Thank God we have an inspector general. Thank God we have courts that are creating standards for people in our custody, particularly young children. But in July of this year, NBC reported allegations of physical and sexual abuse at the hands of CBP officers. Now, Chief Modlin, you have standards for the prevention, detection, and response to sexual assault and in confinement, and that requires CBP to publish annual reports on the effectiveness of your own sexual assault prevention strategies. But I'm wondering why that report has not been filed. It's now 11 months after the end of the fiscal year 2018, and CBP has failed to publish that report.
Ma'am, thanks for the question. What I can tell you is that here I represent the United States Border Patrol, not CBP at large, but what I'm more than happy to do is go back to CBP for you and get the status of that report and have that reported back to you.
Because that report is well overdue to Congress, and I think the actions reflect the priorities and the concerns, and combating sexual violence is a priority of mine, and I think one that we need to take very seriously. So I reviewed CBP's most recently published report and found in FY17 7 allegations of sexual abuse. If you could take back as well to the people in the CBP, there are now 23 complaints of sexual abuse in FY18, and we want to make sure that that is thoroughly investigated and reported.
Yes, ma'am, we absolutely will, and as I'm sure you know, none of that would comport to our standards and what we expect from our agents, and we will look into that, and I'll be happy to get those answers to you.
So switching gears to Director Hayes, what is the criteria for determining which out-of-network facilities are used, and what is the oversight for these facilities? And in particular, we had a network shelter, Rolling Hills Hospital in Oklahoma. In May of 2017, there were serious safety violations including a neglect and abuse by staff at the facility, January of 2018, resulting in a patient being left with a fractured vertebrae, broken foot, and bruising all over the body. So 2 questions. What's the criteria for choosing the facilities, and what's the oversight?
So thank you, Congresswoman. First off, I just want to be crystal clear that any child that would be abused is one too many. And we have policies and procedures in place at the Office of Refugee Resettlement to prevent that. And in the unfortunate occurrence where it might, we have very strict reporting procedures up to the chain of command to the leadership.
And what's
of
the
ORR.
oversight for monitoring the out-of-network facilities?
So I don't have specifics on some of the out-of-network, but I do know that we have because I'm not specifically familiar with this facility you're referencing, but we have a very robust monitoring program that includes both monitoring from our headquarters in D.C., on-site monitoring unannounced, as well as week-long monitoring visits. I think what you're referencing is probably where a medical professional has referred a child for out-of-network care because the needs of that child, either mental health or medical health, cannot be met inside our shelter or particular community. And honestly, I would not speculate why a medical professional chose that particular facility. I'm sure there's a lot of subjective reasons from a medical perspective, and I would not want to speak for the medical person that made that decision.
Okay, switching gears again. Commander White, thank you. You are an American hero. You tried to issue an alarm when you learned that children were being separated from their parents. What we need to focus in on is that apparently that alarm was not heard, and I want to understand specifically where and how. Secretary Azar said that he did not know that children were being separated, and I want to understand if you could, and very briefly, I'll ask the indulgence of the chair, because the committee staff would like to understand what happened with your warning and why wasn't it heard?
So I can only speak to the conversations that I was in. I elevated my concerns and those of my entire team to 3 levels above me in the hierarchy. That would be to my immediate supervisor, then Director of ORR Scott Lloyd, to his supervisor, my agency head, then Acting Assistant Secretary for the Administration for Children and Families, Stephen Wagner, and to his managerial POC on the team, in the immediate office of the Secretary. That was Maggie Wynn, the Counselor for Human Services, to the Secretary. So I elevated these concerns as high as it was possible for me to reach. I really couldn't speak to what conversations occurred other than those that I was in myself.
The gentlelady's time's expired. Gentleman from West Virginia is now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I thought this panel was all about unaccompanied children, but you can see this conversation has drifted to other matters of the separation, the children being grasped away from their parents or whatever. So if we could just get back, and I appreciate, Commander White, you're trying to clarify the difference in this debate between separated children and unaccompanied children, because I think that's what we were supposed to be talking about here today. So, but I'd like to go back as we begin on this whole discussion about crisis. Several of you have talked about that this is a crisis at the border. And so I'd like to, if you could, just quickly, the 4 of you, it's a yes or no. In the past 9 months, during this year, 2019, has there been a crisis at the border? Ms. Maxwell?
As the Inspector General for HHS, our focus is solely on HHS's mission, which is the unaccompanied alien children
It's a
program.
yes or no. Is there been a crisis at the border?
I don't have any immigration expertise in which to make that judgment.
Okay, you ducked it. Say,
Yes, Congressman, there's absolutely crisis at the southern border.
White?
Yes, Congressman, anytime we cannot timely place children in custody, it's a crisis.
Thank you. Chief?
Yes, sir. A border security and a humanitarian crisis at the border.
Well, but yet, part of what we're fighting here in Washington, that's what shows this, the unfortunate divide on this, is that we've got other folks don't agree with you. That there's not been, it's all fabricated story. This was an article that came out in July. It said that this was a manufactured crisis, and even Steny Hoyer went on to say that there is no crisis, there has not been a crisis at the border. The quotes all through this. It's a made-up crisis. Does not exist at the border. It's a fake crisis. Doesn't exist. That's a lie. It couldn't be further from the truth. There is no crisis in arrivals. It's a fiction. I could go on and on with people saying there's no crisis. So it's no wonder we've had this problem dealing with this issue, because people won't accept the reality of what's happening down there by trying to cover up for it. So if I could, and then we have a problem with the reluctance of people, communities, to talk about taking care of these unaccompanied minors. The funding for Democrats, here's an article that came out in late July. The Democrats call for closures of shelters for unaccompanied minors, not to separate, unaccompanied. They want to close those facilities. I think we have to be careful. Then we go to the third, which is where the accompanied minors could go to other communities where they could be housed. But then you just came out in August. Washington D.C. says not here. We're not going to house minors, unaccompanied minors, in Washington D.C. So this whole issue of one after another, it concerns me about where we're going, because if we don't expand the shelters, what are we supposed to do? What are you telling this committee? What are we supposed to do if we're not going to expand the shelters and we're not going to build and occupy facilities around the country? What are we supposed to do? Turn these children loose? Is that what it is? Can someone give me some direction as to what we're supposed to do? If we can't build them and you can't put them in a different community, what are we supposed to do? Because I see some hesitation on your part, because the problem next goes to if these kids aren't in a controlled environment in either Washington D.C. or wherever else that we've heard some of the other communities or in Texas, what kind of medical and psychological care will these kids get if they're not in our control somehow? Will they get it by just drifting on the streets? I need to see it. I'm from West Virginia. I don't see this thing on an everyday basis. So tell me, what happens if we don't put these children in a shelter? Where do they go? Unaccompanied minors.
Congressman, I see your point, and I would just say that I think that's why Congress moved the Unaccompanied Children Program to HHS back in 2003 with the Homeland Security Act of 2002. And the commitment of ORR and the leadership of HHS is to increase our permanent network capacity so that we can receive these children as quick as possible and provide for them the care that we need as we work to get them to a sponsor. So that's our mission, and we would appreciate the continued partnership with Congress in order to move in that direction.
But Mr. Hayes, you're not getting support to expand the facilities, and we're not getting communities willing to accept them. So my question, I understand the policy, but how do we make it work if no one's helping?
Yeah, so the same ask I made yesterday of the Labor H Committee, I would appreciate and help and support from members of Congress in helping educate the communities across this nation, especially here in our own backyard in D.C. and Northern Virginia, as to the critical role and child welfare mission that ORR has, and that the majority of the children in our care are indeed unaccompanied and by statute are required to come into our care and custody as we work to safely find them a sponsor while they're immigration proceedings.
Thank you.
I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about our program, sir, and we can have Congress help us educate the American public on it
How much
and
time
the community a little bit.
expires? Chair now recognizes the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Clark, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman and our Ranking Member Guthrie. One of the issues highlighted across multiple OIG reports relates to certain facilities' failures to conduct background checks as required by ORR policy. So, Mr. Hayes, an OIG report on the Tornillo influx facility that ORR was unaware found that ORR was unaware that the facility was not conducting required background checks. While we understand that ORR policy now requires facilities to inform ORR of an inability to complete required background checks, is ORR implementing any other tool to ensure that each facility is conducting the required checks?
Yes, Congressman, we are. We've issued 2 clarifications this calendar year, one in January and again in March, and I believe the OIG referenced that in their report, clarifying to our grantees the requirements for background checks and investigations of staff prior to coming on board to help care for these children.
And how are you following up on that? I mean, because clearly there's a violation of that.
Right, so we're continuing to follow up on that, and again, to the
How?
conversation I had with Ms.
How
Custer.
is that being done?
Yeah, we continue to do monitoring. We're increasing our monitoring team. And again, we do monitoring both here from DC, desk monitoring. We do on-site unannounced monitoring of our grantees, as well as week-long, very in-depth monitoring. We will
Mr.
continue
Hayes,
this.
another report noted that ORR granted waivers to certain non-influx facilities, allowing these facilities to hire employees without conducting Child Protective Services checks. Instead, in these cases, ORR relied on an employee's self-certification that the employee had a clean child abuse and neglect history. Do you believe self-certifications are an adequate replacement for background checks in ensuring the health and safety of children?
I would not support self-certification, and I'll just point out you're referencing the CAN checks, child abuse and neglect checks, and I think the OIG report also acknowledged that that is a challenge across the entire nation in regards to certain facilities and the access that states
Well,
and
I
federal
think
government
you
to
have a
that.
very specific role here, right? We're not talking about every other instance, right? We're talking specifically about a humanitarian challenge, right? And so my question to you is whether you believe self-certification is adequate given the very special circumstances that we find ourselves in.
Well, I want every single employee that works at our shelters that have access to children to have undergone an FBI background check, and I can assure you that that is the practice and the policies and procedures of ORR to ensure that the children are in a safe environment.
So there is no self-certification?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay. Ms. Maxwell, the OIG report indicates that the hirings that over half of the ORR facilities are facing challenges in hiring and retaining employees, including mental health clinicians and youth care workers. These reports point to hiring issues such as difficulties finding bilingual and qualified candidates, retention issues due to salaries, hours, and competing job opportunities. And your report indicates that these hirings and retention challenges can affect facilities' ability to meet ORR's required staffing ratios. How does an inability to meet these ratios affect the health and safety of unaccompanied children?
Thank you for that question. You're right. We looked at the facility's compliance with the clinical ratios and found about 15 facilities were unable to meet the clinical ratios required by ORR at certain periods of time. And what we heard from the clinicians is that this results in large caseloads, and large caseloads certainly mean that they have challenges providing care that they would like to provide to all the children underneath their supervision.
It appears that the issues that we've discussed today span across multiple facilities. So in your opinion, what should ORR do to improve its oversight of the facilities and their compliance?
We make recommendations that ORR support the facilities in overcoming the challenges to hiring clinical professionals, screening them, as well as retaining them. And we also make recommendations that they think about the possibility of implementing maximum caseloads for these clinicians.
Mr. Hayes, do you believe that your directorate is capable of doing this?
I do, ma'am, and if I could share a few things of what we're working on and have already implemented at ORR. We're working on developing an intern program with colleges and universities in order to place interested students in our facilities, in our programs.
With background checks? You're saying
sorry,
you
what,
want to
ma'am?
put interns into these facilities?
No, working with colleges to identify interns that are working through the clinical field of education in order to educate them on what we do at ORR so that they might, after postgraduate, come and serve as at ORR because, again, there's a national shortage of clinical professionals. Obviously, I want to reiterate, any potential staff person that would have access to the unaccompanied alien children is expected to have undergone an FBI background check.
Gentlelady's time's expired. Chair recognizes the
yield back,
gentleman
Madam
from
Chair.
Virginia, Mr. Griffith, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Hayes, was there anything else you wanted to add on that?
Yes, sir. Thank you, Congressman. I just want to add we're also working with additional funding for continuing education to our licensed clinicians as a retention strategy. We're working to expand our presence at job fairs We've partnered with the National Child Traumatic Stress Network to develop a webinar series on trauma in UAC. And in April of this year, we also hired a board-certified adolescent adult psychiatrist in the Division of Health for Unaccompanied Children inside ORR. Again, to the OIG report, there is an overall nationwide shortage of licensed mental health professionals available, and that does prevent challenges or cause challenges at ORR as well.
Continue with you, Mr. Hayes. You know, we understand migration patterns are unpredictable. You previously testified that you are trying to expand your permanent bed capacity.
Yes, sir.
To account for some of these fluctuations and the influx of unaccompanied children. You asked for some flexibility. What kind of flexibility are you looking for? What do we need to do?
So that's a great question, Congressman. I think one of the key components that is often missed is that whenever we want to have a state-licensed permanent shelter, the final say in that shelter going online and being able to accept children does not lie with the federal government. It lies with the state and local communities in which those shelters reside. And so, you know, I can give a few examples where we've had these smaller size shelters like Dr. Ruiz would like to see us have, which we would like to have as well. But when, when migration patterns are, again, extremely difficult, if not impossible to predict, we have to have flexibility because any HHS ORR shelter is a better environment for an unaccompanied child than a Border Patrol station. I think all of us on this platform, on the dais today would agree with that. And so because those migration patterns are very difficult, if not impossible to predict, we need to be able to have the ability to turn on and turn off beds as quick as possible so that we can get those children out of the Border Patrol stations and into the care that we have. And because I don't have the final say, and again, your colleague from West Virginia highlighted the struggles we have in finding right here in our own backyard in D.C. and Northern Virginia. We want to have these shelters, but if we have reluctance from the local and state officials in doing so, I'm going to have flexibility with some larger or medium-sized shelters that would be influx shelters run by the federal government.
And Representative McKinley did raise the issue about Washington, D.C., and you've now mentioned it a couple of times. Are there other areas where communities are saying, no, we don't want to house those folks here?
I know that we've received formal communication. I think I would probably limit my response to formal communication from D.C. and from the Northern Virginia area, specifically the city of Alexandria and the county of Fairfax.
All right. Now, are folks having to apply to provide these shelters, or are you all going out and looking for existing institutions that already have some expertise in this?
So the answer is both, Congressman. Normally, a grantee will respond to an FOA, a funding opportunity announcement, and we put forward, our team puts forward the needs that we have. We have numerous types of shelters that I've referenced in my opening statement. But we are also now, and this is something that we've been working on, we're now going out ourselves and attempting to find some buildings that we would have control over and then seek to find operators to come in, and that would give us more flexibility. And again, those would be state licensed permanent beds, and that's the one that Dr. Ruiz referenced earlier. The area around LA would be a great area for us to open up a shelter. They have a great population there of clinical and social work professionals that can be bilingual. That are the requirements of ORR. So we're absolutely doing both. We're seeking folks to come in and provide the full range of services, but also finding our own buildings and then finding operators to simply do that. And then we would have the control over those buildings.
I appreciate that. I'm going to switch gears a little bit, and mainly going to ask Commander White, but maybe I'm happy to get information from anybody. I did domestic relations work, and that means child custody, support, et cetera, for probably 10, 11 years of my legal career. I ran into lots of children. I obviously understand the emotional traumas that can happen in all kinds of situations, but also in that. And you referenced in your oral testimony that there were some long-term cardiac issues, if I understood it correctly. We don't have time today to go into all that, but could you give me some of those reports? Because even though I haven't represented some of these kids in a long time, it's one of those things that you worry about when you've done domestic relations work is, what are the long-term prospects for these kids? Can you give me some reports, particularly on the emotional side, I understand, but particularly on the cardiac or other health, besides emotional health, but physical health issues?
Absolutely, Congressman. So the the body of current evidence around toxic stress, including the Shankman studies and the other works out of the Harvard Center on the Child, really does speak to the range of risks that children who experience sustained trauma and high levels of stress can have on a number of domains of lifelong health functioning. That would include many children in our domestic child welfare systems, which is where a lot of that research has been done. That certainly also applies to unaccompanied children who've often experienced extraordinary levels of traumatic exposures in terms of exposure to violence and poverty in home country. It is, those problems are generally compounded for children who experience separation. So yes, sir, we'll be glad to provide you that science.
There you go.
Gentleman's time's expired. Chair Knapp recognizes the chair of the full committee, Mr. Pallone, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This past summer, we saw the disturbing reports of the conditions at a CBP facility in Clint, Texas, that held large numbers of unaccompanied children. Toddlers reportedly had to go without diapers, young children had to look after infants, and visitors reported a stench from the lack of showers and clean clothes. CBP officials will explain that its facilities were never meant to house children, and they're supposed to be quickly transferred to OR so that qualified child welfare experts can provide appropriate care. But clearly that broke down. An El Paso Times article says that CBP officials were trying to warn ORR about the conditions at the facility. When talking about his conversations with ORR at the time, the Border Patrol agent in charge of the Clint station said, and I quote, "We were desperately trying to tell them, we don't have the cell space, the holding space, food contracts. If one of us is going to be over capacity, at least you have the basics. There's only one legal avenue for me to transfer those children. They absolutely have to go to ORR bylaws, so that was my only option." So let me ask Mr. Hayes, how do you respond to that? CBP is seemingly suggesting ORR could have done more than it did to alleviate the situation.
Thank you, Congressman. So it is a true statement that our capacity was strained operationally this last spring, in May and June specifically. Starting in January this year, we did see an increase in referrals over the last calendar year, and HHS made a large number of efforts to increase our capacity as quick as we can. That's one of the flexibility options that I referenced earlier in talking with your colleague from Virginia, that we do need to have that flexibility, and we operated as best we could, again with a limited capacity. But I want to be clear that there wasn't a day that went by that we did not both discharge hundreds of children and also receive hundreds of children from CBP, even during the times of tight capacity in May and June.
Well, the article I mentioned quotes another former Border Patrol official who said, and I quote, "HHS and ORR were not holding up their end of the deal. Border Patrol was moving thousands, and they were moving hundreds." So, Mr. Hayes, again, it sounds like the Border Patrol official is saying that HHS was well aware that the volume of the children would be increasing, but that HHS wasn't freeing up room fast enough by releasing the kids that had to sponsor it. So again, how do you respond to that official who said that ORR was not accepting the kids fast enough?
Well, I would say two things. Number one, we did continue to accept kids every day. I'm not really sure what 1,000 kids the CBP would have been moving, because once we designate a child, ICE has the responsibility to bring those kids to us at HHS. And I just would say that one of the challenges that we saw specifically this spring, sir, was an increase in just a different type of child that was referred to us. We saw an increase in sibling groups. We saw an increase in parenting teams. We saw an increase in, again, the sibling groups younger. We had one teenager, one that was, tender age, which is under 12. And that did present some difficulties in finding the most appropriate shelter for that child.
Well, let me ask Chief Modlin. I understand that CBP cannot transfer children out of its custody until ORR is prepared to accept them. In this instance, when did you realize you had a problem? Could this crisis have been avoided if CBP had reached out to ORR sooner?
Yes, sir. So you're absolutely correct. We cannot move the children to anyone other than HHS, and that's as part of TVPRA. I do believe that the Border Patrol and CBP as a whole sort of sounded the alarms as early and often as we could during this. As you're probably aware, there was quite a few people that insisted that there wasn't a crisis, that we weren't over capacity, that maybe these problems were self-generated. What I do recognize absolutely is that if HHS is not funded and appropriated, and ICE as well, that house our family groups, then there's no place to put them. As I said in my opening statement, we're the only component in this entire chain that has no control over what comes into our custody.
Well, let me. I know we're running out of time, but based on what you said, that I know that the CBP facilities were not intended to house children, but are you going to take any steps to ensure that the children held in the facilities are not faced with similar conditions in the future, or again, is the funding the problem? Is that what you're saying?
So certainly during the time of the height of the crisis, sir, the funding was absolutely the problem. If we ever fell short of our standards, it was because we were overwhelmed. It wasn't because of callousness.
What about now in the future?
Well, I'm unaware of us falling short of any standards now, sir. We've been, since the supplemental funding, we've had shower facilities brought in, we've had washers and dryers brought in, we've had wraparound services, we have a lot of things that we needed during the crisis. What I would also point out is that certainly this crisis is not over. We're still encountering numbers greater than we ever have before. It's certainly down from the May, June numbers, but I would just have everyone please keep that in mind, that this is certainly not over, sir.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
I thank the gentleman. Chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Indiana, Ms. Brooks, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and thank you for holding this really important hearing. I want to build on and ask a little bit more questions about what the chairman of the full committee asked you about, Chief Maudlin. You talked about the height of the crisis, and if I'm not mistaken, during the height of the crisis, CBP and ORR came to the Congress and asked for funding. Is that correct? And asked for help?
Yes, ma'am, we did.
And when CBP and ORR came to Congress and told us that we had what you called the height of the crisis, it took us 6 weeks, didn't it, to get funding?
Yes, ma'am, 57 days, actually.
And what happened during those 57 days of lapse of funding after you came to us and said, we are in crisis mode? And Mr. Hayes, I think you mentioned that for the first time you were in anti-deficiency mode.
Not the first time in the history. It happened in the early 80s at HHS, but definitely was unprecedented at this time. We were in deficiency, and the Anti-Deficiency Act rules and restrictions kicked in at ORR. Yes, ma'am.
And we didn't do anything for 57 days. Is that right? And so what happened? What happened with CBP and ORR during that period of time that we did nothing?
Yes, ma'am. So what happened is we had to reach back into our operational funds, the funding that's meant to help us secure the border and pay for these consumables that were being used, whether it's sanitary items, whether it's formula, it's baby food, it's diapers. As I've testified earlier, our agents purchased diapers themselves and brought them in. They brought in clothing from home. They did everything they could to alleviate as much of the crisis as they could while we were waiting. During that time, we also started to contract with stand-up, soft-sided facilities that you're aware of to increase our capacity. The one thing we never want to do is hold people longer than that 72 hours, but we recognized that we were far over capacity. You know, our capacity on the southwest border is about 4,000 people. At the height of
non-essential services in a very limited basis were affected at ORR. Thankfully, not to a large level, because we fund our grantees often for months out at a time, and so the funding that happened before we went into deficiency did not affect those operations. But had it continued on, it could have affected especially new grantees coming on, providing legal services, recreation, education, all things that we absolutely desire to provide for these children and are required to under the Flores Settlement Agreement.
Thank you, Mr. Maudlin. One of the concerns I've always had is the health, the physical health, not necessarily that I'm not incredibly concerned about the mental health and the challenges we have with the mental health, and not only of the children coming up and leaving home at the time and what their journey is like, and then once they get here, but with respect to flu vaccines, and what types of vaccines children might have when they come. Why are flu vaccines not provided when they're in CBP custody? And I've heard from pediatricians back home of the willingness to have more mobile units that might be able to help CBP, particularly when we have these massive influxes as we've experienced. What are your thoughts on having more mobile units of medical personnel available? Chief Maudlin?
Yes, Congresswoman, what I would say is the Border Patrol is absolutely opposed to vaccinations inside our facilities. It is so far outside our scope and mission that it's basically inconceivable to me to imagine that. We do not want to do anything that would increase the time that these vulnerable populations are in our facilities, whether that's by an hour, whether that's by 2 or 3 days. Where all this needs to take place is in the HHS facilities and facilities that are further down the immigration line, where the comprehensive care and services can be coordinated, and the physicians at CBP agree.
And Mr. Hayes, the issues around vaccines and the physical health of the kids?
Yes, ma'am. So every time a child arrives at one of our shelters within 2 business days, they're required to undergo a full medical examination. We call it an IME, initial medical exam or examination. According to the American Academy of Pediatrics, we provide all the vaccinations as age appropriate to each child. And for any child that is 6 months age or older, we also give them the flu vaccine. Again, each doctor has discretion in regards to that, though.
Thank you. And Madam Chairwoman, I would just like to share that I have also visited the Texas border. I visited a ORR facility in Bristow, Virginia. I visited a new service coming on board in Indianapolis. And one of the things that I heard, which is very troubling, is that part of the reason children are transported in the middle of the night, which people may not realize they're being transported in the middle of the night, it's because our citizens are attacking and chastising ICE and CBP and others and ORR employees who are moving them and who are trying to care for them.
I thank the gentlelady, and her
you.
time's
I yield back.
expired. I now recognize the gentlelady from Illinois, Ms. Schakowsky, for 5 minutes.
I just want to say that I think this period in history right now, which I think is characterized by just unimaginable and unnecessary suffering of immigrants in this country that is a nation of immigrants. Neither of my parents was born in the United States of America, will be long remembered and long criticized. In an April 2018 memorandum of agreement, the Department of Health and Human Services agreed to share information about parents and family members coming forward to sponsor refugee children who arrived alone at the southern border with the Department of Homeland Security. Earlier, this cruel and harmful policy sparked fear in many potential spouses, people who are afraid to come forward. I had an incident at the airport in Chicago on a problem kind of like this. Earlier this month, HHS Office of the Inspector General found that many ORR facilities, quote, reported that it became more difficult to identify sponsors willing to accept children, unquote, and that these difficulties resulted in, quote, delays in placing children with sponsors. These delays caused the average length of stay for children to skyrocket to 93 days in November of 2001. And I wanted to ask you, Mr. Hayes, has ORR considered withdrawing entirely from that MOA? And if not, why?
Yep. So I would answer that question in 2 ways, ma'am. Number one, I think it's important to note that there are certain components to the MOA that we consider very valuable. Referral information that is learned by DHS after the child comes to ORR care. That's information that we would want to be shared, and so that's a information sharing happens. It also memorialized abuse reporting to DHS that HHS might learn about after the child comes into our care. In regards to the negative impact on the average length of care, I became acting director at the very end of November of last year, and a few weeks later, on December 18th, we issued, with my approval, the very first of 4 operational directives that sought to deal with the basically the negative child welfare implications that an increase in length of care was affecting. That allowed us to discharge some 8,000 children in about 30 days. Additionally, in March of this year, we issued a second operational directive that ended the fingerprinting of moms and dads that were already here seeking to sponsor the children. These are not separations. These are moms and dads that were already here. Unless there was a red flag during the public records check, then we would do additional checking.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. So, yeah.
Okay. Ms. Maxwell, let me just say how appreciative I am of the OIG report, and I think it documents so many of the harmful effects of the policies that we have. And what effects do longer length of stays have on ORR facilities' ability to provide adequate health and mental health care to children in custody?
Thank you for that question. We heard a lot about that from the frontline physicians and clinicians that work with these children, and they said that it has a negative effect on their behavior as well as their mental health, and that they saw that children's mental health deteriorated the longer that they were in care, which is why the OIG recommends that ORR look at all current policies with an eye towards trying to figure out if there's anything in there that still negatively impacts the ability to release children in a timely way.
Thank you. What concerns and challenges did the clinicians and providers report with regard to treating children in ORR care, especially those who had been separated from their parents?
The clinicians told us that working with children who had been separated from their parents was more challenging than the population they were used to serving who were unaccompanied as they came across the border. They noted that these children experienced greater sense of fear, abandonment, post-traumatic stress, and that in many cases they were unable to distinguish the federal employees that had separated them from the federal employees who were trying to help them.
And these are long-term effects, right?
That is my
Or can
understanding
be
from the
long-term
clinical
effects.
research, yes.
Thank you. I yield back.
Chair now recognizes the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Duncan, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The Flores settlement was, I believe, 1997. So at least as far back as 1997, we've had children apprehended at our southern border, taken into custody, and ultimately released into the country. In 2011, we saw the beginning, I believe, of the modern unaccompanied children migration into this country. Spiked again in 2014. In fact, I remember having a conversation with President Obama at the Summit of the Americas in Panama in April of 2015. I've got a great picture of it. He and I talking about this issue. And I surprised him because I told him I probably agreed with their administration more than some of my Republican colleagues about increased money going to the Northern Triangle countries to take care of the problem there. I remember that conversation vividly. But to listen to the other side, you would think that the problem of unaccompanied children come to our border and the separation of children from the adults that they are with only happened with the election of Donald J. Trump. No, it's been going on. The past administration, this administration, and as far back as 1997. What concerns me, what I said in the February hearing, and I'll say again today, is that every adult accompanying a child at the border isn't their parent. Human trafficking is real in this world, and it is happening along our southern border, not only with women sold into sex slavery, other types of human trafficking, but also child trafficking, and possibly child sex trafficking that's unfathomable. So when a child shows up at a CBP facility or apprehended by officers out in the desert, and that child is accompanied by an adult, I think it's very important that our nation tries to determine who that adult is and what situation that child might be in. Now, there are a lot of situations where family units come and the children are with their parents. But you don't know that by looking at them. After they've come across the desert with dirt and sweat, stained faces. It's important for the health and well-being of that child for us to separate that child from that adult and figure out whether that's their parent or whether that's a coyote bringing them across the border or a trafficker hoping to sell that child into some form of slavery. So I appreciate this nation taking the well-being of that child into consideration and determining who that adult is with that child. Because I can only imagine some of the horrors that that child has probably seen on his journey north. And I don't like to think about the horrors that that child may have endured on their journey north. And I definitely don't want to think about the children that we don't apprehend, that make it into this country with those coyotes, those human traffickers, those sex traffickers, and end up in abominable situations. Now, we can play politics and we can blame this administration or that administration for separating children at the border and trying to determine who the adults are. We can play the blame game and we can play politics and all that. But I want to applaud the men and women sitting at this table for trying to have the best interest of those children at heart. Now, the question I have for Mr. Hayes, how do we get DNA testing in this so that we can more rapidly determine the familiar relationship between that child and that adult they're with, or the lack thereof, so that we can prosecute that human trafficker? But if they are related, how can we more rapidly reunite those families?
So, Congressman, thank you for that question. ORR does not use DNA testing en masse. We did use it, and I would defer to my colleague, Commander White, in some of the reunification efforts that were, under the court order deadline last summer. It was very different from the normal ORR policies and procedures. I also think my colleagues at CBP could probably address some of what they do on the spot. I know I've had reports that's happening, and there's increasing in that.
I'm out of time, and maybe the chairwoman will let them answer, but I will say this. I think the goal, all of us, is to make sure that those families are reunited as soon as possible. Madam Chair, I'll yield back.
Thank you. Chairman yields back. Chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Castor, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for your efforts to shine a light on this, because this new report chronicles the harm inflicted on children due to the cruel policy of family separation instituted by the Trump administration. This report now confirms it in the most sweeping fashion, of any analysis done to date. And I want to thank the Office of Inspector General for doing this, and the fact that these children are likely never to recover from the pain and cruelty will be a stain on this administration forever. Ms. Maxwell, one of the key findings in your report is that the kids sent to ORR facilities had previously experienced intense trauma, such as physical or sexual abuse and other forms of violence within their country of origin, even before their entry into the United States. Is that correct?
That is correct. That's what we heard.
And your report found that family separations resulted in a whole new level of trauma inflicted on the children. The report states that, quote, according to program directors and mental health clinicians, separated children exhibited more fear, feelings of abandonment, and post-traumatic stress than did the children who were not separated. Is that correct?
That is correct.
You also found that, quote, separation from parents and a hectic reunification process added to the trauma that children had already experienced and put tremendous pressure
on the professionals in the facilities. Is that correct?
Indeed it is, yes.
So let me highlight a few examples of how the family separation policy made the jobs of ORR providers even harder than it normally is. Your report found, for example, that some separated children could not distinguish facility staff from the immigration agents who separated them from their parents. You also quote a program clinician who said, quote, "Every single separated kid has been terrified. We're seen as the enemy." Is that accurate?
Yes, we heard a number of heartbreaking stories from the frontline staff who treat these children.
And we've heard that some within HHS, at least some ORR career officials, were trying to sound the alarm that a forced separation policy would be harmful for the children and would strain ORR, but it's not clear what happened to those concerns. Given that these concerns prove valid, are there lessons for HHS leadership about why these warnings, either within the department or outside the department, were not taken more seriously?
The Inspector General has a wide range of work that we are doing looking at the health and safety of children in the facilities, but in addition to that work, we are exploring the factors that challenge the department as well as the facilities and reunifying the children separate from the parents. And as part of that work that is upcoming, we are in fact looking at the interagency communication prior to the official adoption of the zero tolerance policy.
And we're trying to get those documents as well, but the administration has stonewalled us. Have they stonewalled you as well?
To the best of our knowledge, they have been forthcoming with documents to the Inspector General and have made staff available for our interview and discussion.
How can you ensure that you've gotten all of the documents and correspondence and emails?
That is an excellent question that we have asked ourselves many, many times. We have been engaging probably over the last year with the department. We have our legal counsel involved and working with the OGC within the department to assure us that we have received all responsive documents to our requests.
Are you confident that that's been the case, or do you still have questions about that?
We have had in-depth conversations with the department about how they procured the documents, the algorithms that they used, the technology they used, and at this point, we do feel confident that the department has been responsive to our requests.
Has HHS leadership conducted an internal lessons learned assessment about what happened here?
I would have to defer that question to the department.
Do you think they should?
I certainly hope that our report that comes out looking at this will in fact drive positive change and some reassessment and lessons learned for the department. Absolutely.
Mr. Hayes, have you had time to, well, I hate to put it this way. I mean, this is such a sweeping report and such a damning indictment on this policy. I mean, certainly you've gone back and accepted responsibility for what has happened.
Well, I just want to be clear, the family separation and zero tolerance was before my time at HHS, but I will say that myself, and there's a letter from Assistant Secretary Johnson, my immediate supervisor back to the OIG, we concurred with their recommendations, and we are working on implementing those. And when I became permanent director earlier this year, ma'am, and I think if you polled any of the senior career staff at ORR, it was absolutely my desire to change the culture and how we operate inside there. I absolutely, every single day, undergo best practices discussions and rely heavily on the counsel of my senior career staff at ORR, both the child welfare experts and the medical team, our policy team, and the operations team. They're the experts.
And if that's the case, I encourage you to do a better job with providing the documents to this oversight committee that needs to happen.
Okay, that would be with the Assistant Secretary of Legislation and her team, and it's my understanding that the committee staff and her team are working on that.
Gentlelady yields back. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Mullen, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for everyone that's here. Obviously, you're doing the best job you can underneath the conditions, and I just want to tell you thank you. I know it can be difficult, and sometimes you can come up here on the Hill and feel like you've been kicked around a little bit, but I think everybody's passionate about it. It doesn't matter what side of the aisle you're on. We may look at it a little bit different, but I do want to thank you for your service. It means a lot to all of us. Mr. Hayes, in response to the surge of the unoccupied children crossing the border back in 14. Did the Obama administration use temporary shelters to house and care for unoccupied children?
Yes, sir, they did.
Do we have any of those still open today?
No, sir, we do not.
I thought Homestead in Florida was stood up.
Homestead was selected as a site, and the provider was sometime in very late 2015, sir.
In 2015?
Yeah, December, I believe.
But it was still underneath the Obama administration that it was stood up, though.
That is correct. In the last administration, the site and provider was chosen at Homestead, December 2015.
And that was specifically in response to the unoccupied children in the surge of 14?
That is correct.
Okay.
It was brought on as an influx shelter, Congressman.
Just making sure I was clear on there. Commander White, what was the policy during the Obama administration of to determine if the children were indeed with their parents or family members when they were crossing the border?
So the determination as to whether a child is accompanied by a parent or is unaccompanied is a DHS determination, not an HHS determination, unfortunately.
Well, you stated that she was raising flags about the zero tolerance policy. So that will tell you that there must have been some separation that was taking place before the zero tolerance policy came into place underneath the Trump administration. But was there separation taking place underneath the Obama administration?
There have always been, for the history of the program, a small number of separations for cause. However, no one should confuse that with the reality in the world that changed approximately July of 2017 when there was a tenfold increase in the percentage of referrals per month that were a result of separation. That in turn further increased with the formal announcement of ZTP.
What was the reasoning behind the zero tolerance?
That is a question you'd have to submit to the Department of Justice. I wasn't in that conversation.
What we were told was because of the threat of human trafficking and the fact that what our ranking member Walden's pointed out was that some of these children are actually being recycled, and we're seeing the same children, that they were being trafficked too. And so that's why the zero tolerance, because we had to figure out, and correct me if I'm wrong here, Commander White, we had to figure out if they were actually with family, because which is worse? Keeping them with a trafficker or making sure that they're with their family so we can make sure they're with a loved one, because it's not like they're coming across the line with a birth certificate and proof that it's actually their child. How are we supposed to know if we don't have genetics to test that they're actually with them?
Congressman, these are two extremely important but entirely separate issues.
Not really.
The children who experience separation from their parents are not the children who were exclusion cases.
Hold on, Commander White. I'm not trying to argue with you. I'm trying to figure out how else do you determine them? Are you just supposed to take the individual's word for it? Because I know coyotes don't lie and traffickers don't lie. I mean, they always tell the truth as soon as you get them. I mean, these are individuals that cross the border illegally, so they already broke the laws. So how is it that we're supposed to do our due diligence on figuring out if the individual is actually related to or is the parent of the child?
That is done both by CBP for its
How
part
else
in the
do you
operation
do that until
and by
you separate?
The method that is used in ORR is verification of relationship through consular verified birth certificates or whether those are
If it doesn't exist, what do you do?
In those cases, DNA confirmation of biological maternity.
In the meantime, do you separate or keep them together?
To be clear, Congressman, you are confusing two issues. One is separation for cause, and the other is separation pursuant to ZTP.
Well, but there was zero tolerance.
Different.
I'm not confusing the two. In all due respect, I appreciate it. I know darn good and well what I'm talking about.
You
specifically said about the zero tolerance. That is what you have referred to multiple times. What I'm saying is what was the determination prior to the zero determination to figure it out? And if that didn't exist, what do you do at that point? Because you're the one that has been saying that you raised red flags and concerns about it. Well, but at the same time, the Trump administration was raising red flags and concerns about keeping them with people that they can't verify the individual is actually with them or not. And then there is no such thing as forged documents. You and I both know that. Ha, ha, ha. So what is the determination? Because we know coyotes, we know the traffickers, the cartels are not sophisticated enough to understand what our policies are to start making false documentations to actually try pairing them together. So what else are we supposed to do?
The gentleman's time's expired, but I will allow, as I have with the other members on both sides who have asked the questions, I'll allow the witness to answer the questions asked.
The specific methods used by CBP to determine if there are doubts for parentage or not, which I have tremendous confidence in, I would defer to my colleague from CBP. I certainly can speak to our methods in ORR, but I want to be clear that in the numbers that we have all reported regarding separations, those exclude all cases where there was any determination that these were not parents. So when we speak of the numbers in the Ms. L case, which I provided in my testimony, those are all parental cases, not covered by an exclusion, such as danger to the child. And I just want to be clear about that, because the Congressman is exactly right. The issue of false families is a compelling concern for both DHS and HHS, but it's a separate issue from family separation.
I thank the witness. The Chair now recognizes the very patient gentlelady from California, Ms. Berrigan, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First of all, just to correct the record, since we're talking about what information we're going to give to determine who are adults in this debate, first of all, there have been allegations that separations have been, like the one happening under the Trump administration, have been happening for a long time under different administrations. Prior administrations used prosecutorial discretion. This administration, specifically Secretary Kelly, came to Congress and said one of the reasons they were doing it was to deter people. It was intentional to deter people, and they were going to get rid of using the prosecutorial discretion. So wanted to just correct that because there's so much false information going around on that. Second of all, children have not died until this current administration. Ms. Maxwell, you testified earlier that children, when they come over, they have already experienced some type of trauma prior to arrival. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And would you say that if you come here as a child and you're separated from a parent, that would cause further trauma?
That is what we heard from the clinicians in the field.
Okay. And would you say that if a child were separated and experienced sexual abuse or assault, that would lead to further trauma?
We are looking at that in our next study, but certainly that would be another type of trauma.
Do you not think that if a child is sexually abused, that they would experience trauma?
That's certainly another type of trauma. It's just not one that we particularly focus on in this study, and we will be focusing on that in a few
Is it your opinion that if a child is sexually abused, they would be further traumatized?
Oh, of course.
Okay. Is it your opinion that if a child was slapped around and dragged, that they would suffer trauma from that interaction?
Yes, I would just point out that the benefit of our report is that we are bringing voices from the field, and we're really relying on what they're telling us about what they experience with the children.
Right. And Commander White, the Southwest Keys locations, those are ORR custody, is that correct?
Correct, and I'll
Okay.
defer to Mr. Hayes about the Chronos, but yes, Southwest Key is one of the large providers of ORR services to children.
Thank you. The reason I'm asking this series of questions is because these are the types of allegations and videos that have shown is happening in ORR custody. And our children, while they may have arrived with some kind of trauma because of the violence in their home country, are being further traumatized, whether it's due separation, whether it's due through sexual abuse, whether it's through being physically abused, through slapped around and dragged around. And it's unacceptable. It's completely unacceptable. I have introduced a bill, H.R. 1336. It's a mental health care bill for children inhumanely separated from their parents by the federal government. And we hear that when children get into ORR, they get some kind of mental health evaluation. But doesn't that mental health service end when the child's detention ends, Ms. Maxwell?
Yes, that is my understanding.
Right. So this bill would say that if a child suffers from mental health issues, that they would get ongoing coverage regardless of whether they're in custody or not. If we're causing additional trauma to a child, I think that we have the responsibility to provide services for these children. As one of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle said, we should treat these children like they're ours. I want to follow up a little bit on my colleagues' questioning about the new OIG report. It's certainly disturbing. It lays out there the carnage that the family separations unleashed on these children. HHS claimed innocence in the family separation crisis and has said it did not know about the policy, but the committee has obtained multiple documents that demonstrate this isn't quite the full story. ORR career staff were sounding the alarm bells to HHS leaders nearly a year before the administration's cruel zero tolerance policy was enacted. We obtained a July 2017 memo from HHS that's in the document binder that all of you have. In that memo, nearly a year before family separations began, Commander White warned of family separations that were to be implemented. That's tab number 2 in the binder. In September 2017, HHS staff again referred to a new DHS policy to separate families. That's binder document 6. And leaders within HHS were also talking about family separation policies. In November 2017, still well before the zero tolerance policy was enacted, Eric Hargan, the then acting secretary who now serves as deputy secretary, requested a briefing on family separations, tab 10. We even have emails from Mr. Hayes' predecessor, Scott Lloyd, the then director of ORR, who said that ORR noticed CBP was separating families before zero tolerance, and ORR was tracking it. ORR and HHS leadership either saw this coming or should have seen this coming, and because HHS leadership ignored these warnings, the worst fears were realized. Mr. Hayes, just a quick question. I understand you were not in your position at the time, but if you had received these warnings in the year leading up to zero tolerance, what would you have done with that information?
If I receive any information from my senior career staff that raises child welfare concerns, I would share those with my immediate supervisor, Assistant Secretary Lynn Johnson.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman's time's expired. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Cardenas, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairwoman and colleagues, for having this incredibly important hearing on an issue that affects human beings who have come to our country in many, many, many cases to flee violence and in some cases almost certain death. And I hope and pray that we all learn from this, both as practitioners in the field and also as policymakers as well, as to what should be our path forward to making sure that we respect not only the Constitution, but we respect the human beings that are in our custody and in our care. When it comes to traumatic consequences on children's mental health, and it's not just the HHS or OIG that has come to this conclusion, it seems to be a universal understanding and belief based on science and fact. That's why we have protections under the Florida settlement to prevent children from being indefinitely detained. Despite those protections, the Trump administration has issued a rule that would essentially dismantle Flores and permit DHS to detain children and families beyond the current 20-day limitation. Ms. Maxwell, in the recently released HHS OIG report, your office notes, and I'll quote, "Children with longer stays experienced more stress, anxiety, and behavioral issues." The report adds that, quote, "Some children who did not initially exhibit mental health or behavioral issues began reacting negatively as their stays grew longer." Ms. Maxwell, based on these findings, would you agree or disagree that an increased length of detention can have detrimental effects on children?
Certainly, as it respects to our report, we showed that length of stay has a negative effect on children's well-being. I'll just note that our focus was on ORR facilities, and the detention policy you're referencing is for immigration detention centers. So our report speaks only to once they have already gone from the detention center into an ORR facility. And yes, absolutely, what the clinicians at the front line told us is that the longer the children are in care, the more difficult their behavior becomes, and the more disillusioned they become, and the more mental health troubles they see, even including self-harm and suicidal ideation.
Has there ever been an opinion, a professional opinion or a study of value that actually says that there's a differentiation between what moniker is on the door of the facility that the child is in when they're experiencing this trauma?
I would just offer that the facilities that ORR runs are state licensed child welfare facilities that are governed by Flores and provide a whole host of child-centric services, which are different than immigration detention centers that have a different mission.
Okay. Commander White, when you testified before the subcommittee in February, you stated, and I'll quote, "Toxic stress has consequences, both for children's behavioral health and their physical health, and those consequences are frequently lifelong." Commander White, is there any reason to doubt the decades of research on the long-term traumatic effects on children who are detained, or, for example, or the UN's position on the detention of children?
The available scientific consensus of the effects of toxic stress, particularly in the available literature on children in detention, I see no reason to question that scientific consensus. It is well established and supported by evidence.
Should the stress inflicted on children due to detention be a relevant consideration when drafting rules related to child detainment?
I can't speak to law enforcement or detention. It is fundamental to any discussion of our work in ORR on child welfare.
With experts in the field emphasizing the detrimental effects of prolonged detention on children, I'm concerned about who's looking out for the best interests of the affected children. Mr. Hayes, ORR is the expert on child welfare. What role did your agency play in writing this regulation, especially on the decision to allow prolonged detention of children?
So, Congressman, thank you for the question. So the role the role that HHS played was very limited in regards to the overall rule. It sought to codify, consistent with the Homeland Security Act and TVPRA rules and regulations. We focused on our part. One of the examples, I think, was kind of the movement of some of the hearings from the Department of Justice over to the Department of Appeals Board, which would be inside of HHS by independent hearing officers in regards to certain discharges. But the overwhelming majority of the Flores rule was DHS.
Okay. Thank you very much. My time's expired. I'll yield back.
Now yields to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Soto, 5 minutes for purpose of questioning.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Director Hayes, I had sent you all a letter on September 10th regarding the proposed facility in Central Florida. We ended up finding out about this because a notice was sent to our local government officials, but not to members of Congress, folks who have oversight over HHS. So I was really surprised about that, that I would find out through my local mayor rather than directly from HHS. What is the nature of the detention center that you all are looking to put in Central Florida?
So to Ms. Maxwell's point, we don't have any detention facilities at HHS. Ours are child welfare shelters that are licensed by the respective state. And I'll just say, Congressman, as we look to expand our permanent state license network, we have a process at HHS where we do notify members of Congress, local officials, and if you were not notified, I apologize on behalf of our department.
So what is the nature of the facility, generally speaking, that you're looking to locate in Central Florida?
Absolutely, sir. So we're looking at a number of sites in conjunction with the GSA to identify some smaller to medium-sized facilities where we can, again, with prior interactions that I've had with your colleagues on the platform today, where we want to, again, expand our state licensed permanent network. We're looking to own or lease some of those buildings ourselves, which is a kind of change of how we operate at HHS in order to give us more control over the capacity. And then we, in turn, find operators to come in and run those as the child welfare folks within each of those shelters. So, yes, sir, Central Florida is an area, given the population, the bilingual nature of a lot of the constituents there, the educational opportunities in order to bring both youth care workers and clinicians on board. We have other areas that we're also looking at here in the D.C., Northern Virginia area, New York,
what would be
LA.
The age group of the refugees who would be housed there?
It's really too early to say because, again, we have a large number of different types of shelters we're looking at. I will say this, sir, the majority of the children in our care at ORR are teenagers, and 13 to 17, and the majority of those are male. But we do need, again, specialty beds for parenting teens, sibling groups, pregnant mothers that will deliver while in our care. And so, so we need a broad array of different type of shelters and beds in order to timely receive these children from CBP so we can care for them.
So you anticipate this center could be used to house children as well as adults based upon your current
Absolutely not,
strategy?
sir. HHS does not have any authority to house adults. These would be, when I say a parenting
So for
team,
children
I'm
or
sorry.
for women who are pregnant and having children?
Yeah, let me clarify that, sir. I apologize. In that case, we are talking about 2 unaccompanied alien children. The mother herself is a child that is under the age of 18 and is unaccompanied, and either the child that she has with her or the child that she would deliver would also be a UAC. So we would keep them together.
Well, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the strong opposition locally to putting a center there. I want to turn also to Homestead next.
Yes, sir.
I was welcome to headlines today about ORR spending $33 million so far since that facility has been vacated. Why hasn't this facility been closed yet?
So that's a good question, Congressman. I welcome the opportunity to expand on the article that I think left out a lot of key facts and even misconstrued some things. Number one, there have not been any children there since August 3rd. That is an accurate statement. Shortly thereafter, we did reduce the number of staff and the supportable census from 2,700 down to 1,200. And in coordination with my planning and logistics team, again, senior career staff whose counsel I value significantly at ORR, and the fact that these migration numbers are difficult, if not impossible, to predict, those 1,200 beds are something that we wanted to be able to have quick access to in the event of an emergency, because a UAC is better off in any HHS facility as opposed to a Border Patrol station.
We also had asked when that facility was at least in part shuttered, where the children who were staying there went. 70% we were informed were reunited, but we never got a response on where the rest of these children were sent to. I'm getting, to this date, requests from my constituents to know the details of this because it happened in our state. And again, a deeply unpopular program and a deeply unpopular center because it's against a lot of our values in immigration. And I realize you're here to manage it, not direct that policy. But will you commit to me today to get us a response on where the rest of the 30% of the children ended up being relocated to?
I won't commit to the specifics out of privacy and concerns and respect for the children, but I will say that the majority of them that were transferred to other sites within ORR's network, sir, were either due to medical reasons or they simply don't have identifiable sponsors here in the United States, and therefore they could not be discharged to family like you said. In fact, I think it ended up being actually more than 80% of them were discharged to family members.
Well, without names, it would be great to get at least the statistics on where these kids went so I could respond to constituent questions about this.
We've put those numbers forward, sir, and I believe they've even been shared with the media, so I don't see any reason why the Assistant Secretary for Legislation and her team couldn't get those to you in a timely fashion.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, sir.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes the ranking member for any closing remarks he might have.
Thank you very much. So we're not doing questions, just closing remarks, right?
Well, you can do questions.
Okay. So,
It's your time.
well, I'll just close. So it's important that we do this and have oversight, and we know that there's been issues at the border. There has been crisis at the border. I know, and I know what my friend Mr. McKinley was talking about. People were on the floor of the House saying there's not a crisis at the border, and the media not a crisis at the border, and there was. And so we need to do oversight. It's our job as members of Congress to make sure that things that in our jurisdiction we have the oversight to look forward. And one, to see what was the problem, how do we solve the problem, and how can Congress help solve the problem. But the one thing that you want to see is that people are trying to address the problem and not just let it linger until Congress steps in and does something. And I think today, hopefully people see that there is a big effort to make sure the problems that have happened at the BP facilities, at getting them into ORR, tracking, or not tracking, but understanding the data between the children is really being addressed. So I really appreciate that. I think also we need to look at a mirror. I think that we're talked about 72 hours, we talked about 50 days, and how long is too long. I thought it was a little over 6 weeks, but I think, Chief, you said 57 days from the time you requested supplemental funding until the time it was approved by Congress?
Yes, sir, 57 days.
And I'm not one to say we should have done it on day one. Congress has its duty to do due diligence and make sure any budget request, particularly of that size, is is appropriate. But if we remember what happened in the spring, it was brought forward. We went through the spring, and all of a sudden, and we had different debates on the floor and appropriations bills as Republicans tried motions to recommit. The appropriate chairman and people on the appropriation committee said, we know it's important, we're going to do it, but not here, not here, not here. It kept lingering to the point where a group of Republicans would hold time on the floor every day in June to try to do different tactics to try to bring it to the attention. And it took to right before the break for 4th of July for us to get a bill that you say has made a major difference at the border. So I think 57 days, 72 hours is we want to get them out of your facility sooner than 72 hours. We want them out of your facility sooner than 50. But 57 days is way too long for Congress to do its job, to give you the resources you need to make the improvements that you have made. And we appreciate that, and I appreciate you being here. And we still have a lot of work to do, and we're willing to work with you to do it. And I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen. Chief Maudlin, your career with the Border Patrol, is that right? You've been there a long time.
Yes, ma'am, 24 years with
24
the US
years,
Border Patrol.
and I want to thank you for your service. And I also want you to communicate to your agents there at the border and your employees that we really appreciate their service too. And what you're saying, when you said they were bringing diapers from home, and they don't want to be thrust into this any more than anybody else does. And it's the same thing with the ORR personnel. When we had the family separation, I went down and I talked to some of those personnel, and they were just doing their best. These rank and file folks, they're just doing their best. And I understand that. Some people have said, well, the Democrats don't understand that. They think that the Border Patrol people are cruel. We do not think that at all.
Ma'am,
And
if I could,
yeah, go ahead.
I will definitely bring that message
Thank
back.
you.
As I know you're aware, there's definitely a vilification of the Border Patrol. What I can
Right.
tell you is that more than 128 agents have died in the line of duty
bet.
protecting this country. Some of those agents have died, they've drowned while trying to rescue migrants from the Rio Grande.
right.
They've been run over by drug smugglers, they've been shot by drug smugglers and TCOs. These are agents that do everything every day and act professionally, compassionately, and sacrificing, or willing to sacrifice their lives for this country, for those migrants, to secure the nation.
For human rights.
So I
And
do appreciate your words.
And I agree. So in your years with the Border Patrol, I think you can agree, and I think Commander White, you would see this too, is we do have a historic waxing and waning of the number of people presenting at the border. It happens by the seasons. Isn't that correct? Yes or no? Will work.
So there is
Right.
certainly seasonal trends. These numbers have never been seen before. This was not a
Right.
seasonal trend.
But we have the seasonal trends, so then we saw these numbers. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle keep talking about how we had a huge influx of unaccompanied minors in 2014 under the Obama administration. So we have had an uncertainty at the border now for about 5 years or more. And I myself am not particularly interested in blaming, one person or another for this influx of people, but today I'm worried about the kids. So then we keep hearing this continual bashing about 57 days for the emergency supplemental, but the fact is, this has been going on for a long time. And what we need to develop, I think what HHS needs to develop and what Homeland Security needs to develop is a policy that we can somehow deal with these surges of children that come for whatever reason so that the human rights of these children can be preserved. And Commander White, this is what you have been saying for several years, and I want to commend you for saying that. Irrespective of what's happening, is if you have kids that are being held and for whatever reason they're separated from their parents, they're being held without basic cleanliness or anything, this is psychologically damaging in the long run, and that's what the IG report shows. So my concern is that we develop a policy that has interoperability between the two departments so we can know how to treat the kids that are in the Border Patrol custody and get them transferred, but also so that we can keep them united with their parents or whoever else so that they suffer as little additional trauma as possible after what they've experienced. And I think we should be able to do that on a bipartisan basis. And so this leads me to my last point, which is we have got to get these documents, because we've been trying to figure out for 8 months now documents regarding how far up the chain the knowledge of this family separation went. Commander White, you saw in the notebook, we've gotten some documents that indicate that there was discussion of the family separation for some months before it actually happened. What we're trying to find out is how far up the chain this knowledge went, and the fact that HHS has steadfastly refused to provide those documents to this committee is really disturbing, because we can't move forward until we know exactly what happened. And so this is why I'm going, Mr. Hayes, I'm going to make one more plea. I know you're not the person in charge of this, but I'm going to make one more plea. We've narrowed the list down. We need it for investigation, and this is what this committee's role is. And so we're going to keep pushing ahead on this. And I just want to say one last time, Commander White, I want to commend you for your dedication to these children. I know you have been, as a career civil servant, fighting for them for day one. And this committee on both sides of the aisle, we appreciate all of the service that you give to this country, and we thank you, and we hope you will continue to do that. And last but not least, I want to ask unanimous consent that the contents of the document binder be introduced into the record, and to authorize staff to make appropriate redactions. That objection is so ordered. I want to thank the witnesses for coming today, and I want to remind members that pursuant to the committee rules, they have 10 business days to submit additional questions for the record to be answered by witnesses who have appeared before the subcommittee. I ask that the witnesses agree to respond promptly to such questions, and with that, the subcommittee is adjourned.
Thank you. All right, good job.